Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
It happens. Camille thought, staring at the TV screen. She'd been a pharmacist for about a year and noticed that she could now view both the frightening news and the wall in her office with equal indifference, or the pastries behind the counter at the business center cafe. It's not to say that the zest for life has gone away. It must have gotten a little bland. Camille watched trains crash from airplanes without interest, no admiration or anticipation. Tastes like the lowly ruins she used to love to indulge in on Friday, as if at the end of a workday or on a Wednesday to give herself a little dope, a little prohibition. She joked with her office friends, and the joke was a success with them. Dose forbidden, called small pleasures that allow as if to slip away from the workday, and completely unnoticed by others. So, for example, a delicious and sweet brownie with meringue chocolate touches gorgeous nutty references. Chef Wendy, who worked at Cafe Delicious, the owner, made the interior in style with accents on anime cartoons and occasionally added recipes from those cartoons. He regularly experimented with dessert and knew Camille as well as her tastes. So sometimes he would try to make some special Earl's Ruin that they could talk about a bit behind the counter when he looked out of the kitchen. And Camille would be waiting for her coffee, or when they crossed paths on the way to the parking lot from the office building. They'd joke about the new flavor, about dessert, about which Count's castle had now fallen apart. It gave a burst of calories and a serving of endorphins. In general, after a tasty, and that still as if honey with different additives dessert, and still drink good coffee. The middle of the day ISO dull drudgery turned into the good news that more than half of the work is done. A nice evening out with girlfriends or with your spouse ahead. Cereal check or a book. A bunch of funny thoughts popped into my head. The dreary guys in the office were now not energized by NY, but looked funny. This secret way of escape helped to find freedom in the conditions of corporate everyday life from a working bee, which swarms in its honeycomb, extracting unknown honey, unknown to whom to turn into a proud Orly, which looks with a little snobbery and disdain from its height at the bustle of days. Camille and the unfaithful office girlfriends had a whole arsenal of such forbidden. One of them carried candy in her purse. Finland. Sure, some might say it's about working alcoholism, but the difference between the locksmith who bangs on a glass before work and at lunch and Camille and her girlfriends was clear and noticeable. That said, the point of prohibition was to use these methods fairly infrequently. The candy could lie in the bag, Emily, for weeks, and only occasionally she have a boring meeting. She would shove her girlfriends to the side. At large meetings, when in a large conference hall, similar to a lecture hall, gathered all departments or mentally pushed to the side of herself, when the boss gathered in a more chamber-like atmosphere only their department and realized its time, candy was taken out and handed out of the bag. The chocolate shell was dispensed from hidden behind a sugar on caramel layer of a couple grams of fiery water, flowing over the surface of the tongue of intoxication. Such candies, of course, did not provide any more feeling or flavor. Nevertheless, they always worked for sure. Boring stories and presentations became much more engaging, the lighting more pleasant, and the words of others ceased to give off such a harshness of sharpness. There was now no sharpness in the perception found. The problem was that there wasn't much to it at all. Her friends at work didn't notice the change, mistaking the found apoliticalness for calmness. They thought their specialist Camille worked as one of the deputies in the human resources department of a large logistics company, had learned some special zen. She is, after all, the psychologist that Rick read at the Institute, and still sometimes goes to all kinds of whales. The friends sometimes listened with pleasure on Odin esoteric stories and reasoning, but more for the sake of entertainment and a sense of exoticism. They also treated her to psychological advice, which she gave unobtrusively, but quite accurately, well versed in the peculiarities of each of her friends. However, neither Evelyn was Emily, nor the more age-appropriate. Veronica Platonovna did not particularly listen to this advice. After all, where is it? Psychology. and life. Here, too, everything is clear without any psychology. Sebastian, her spouse, didn't notice the change either. In style, he did not feel her particularly well, and outwardly they remained passionate and active in their communication. Sebastian tried to be sweet and caring, but for the most part, he played the role as if he were always standing on stage in front of an audience that was carefully observing and evaluating his playing the good and caring spouse. So Sebastian, whom Camille in her esoteric way called Chance, was a word associated with peace, and at the beginning of the relationship he could really give some kind of marvelous peace, more concerned with playing well and being more contented with the audience than with Camille herself. Of course, it became more noticeable that she was more silent or more often wanted to stay at home than to go to a concert or for a walk. But Sebastian thought they were becoming more serious and in some ways boring neighbors. But such is the natural course of things, and the audience watching them play the role of a good family not only doesn't accept such boredom, but thinks it's important for good families to be moderately boring, quiet. In addition to the girls from work, Camille had two friends. Camille considered the two of them at once and did not particularly distinguish between them. But others still thought that the huge tunnel bass and the institute girlfriend Wendy should not be equaled. Camille was of a different opinion and thought that a dog was also a human being. At least her Jenna certainly was. The two of them often made themselves comfortable in a large leather and eerily expensive and rumpled chair that the boss had allowed her to pick up during another office redesign. The chair used to stand in the CEO's small reception area. Only very important assholes sat in it. Therefore, Camille thought that it was definitely not worth squeamishness and should be taken near. Moreover, maybe the aura of wealth and wealthiness would add to the prosperity of their house with Sebastian. The salary really increased after that. Camille also had a couple of students whom she sometimes helped by tutoring. But was it the result of aura, wealth, or the planned indexing of salaries and Yandex advertising? Camille left the questions unanswered. After all, how could one know? Maybe the decision to moonlight as a tutor had come after sitting in the chair, but would have continued to sit on the couch with Sebastian. At most, she'd have thought of a new card with a check on it. Anyway, Camille and Jenna would often sit on that immense, giant-looking chair and stare out the TV or window. Nellie would lay Camille's head on her chest, and Milo would sing. Sometimes they would stare into each other's eyes for a long time. Camille would shift her gaze to the sky outside the window and catch the feeling of ultimate serenity. It also seemed that Jenna understood her well without words, and their conversation was at least as good as the pleasant chit-chat with Wendy's friends. And irregularly they even sat, probably lingering on Wendy in the narrow kitchen and drinking strong coffee, heavy and thoughtful conversation discussing the news and long philosophical musings. Wendy, unlike her found girlfriends at work, understood psychology, and out of the five she not only could keep the conversation on topic, but had something to say. Here's the thing. It may seem vulgar and primitive to you, of course. Wendy ran her fingers over her crumpet and a detached gaze contemplated the branching trees outside the window of her crusty apartment building. There is androgen. And the idea of a whole person of both sexes sort of is. As if there is, nodded the person sitting across from you, Camille, enjoying the inspiring rush of your coffee enthusiasm, inhaling the coffee and anticipating another deliciously funny conversation with her friend. In the communication of the sexes, which is also called at us decent young ladies intimate, harmony is kind of restored and we create a goddess, that is, a perfect being. Right. Pistil mysticism, stamens bolts, and nuts, an elaborate harmony. I understand your irony. Wendy gave her friend a brief glance with a smile. But in essence, it's bolts and nuts. So right off the bat she sort of said what might seem vulgar. Kind of go on. As if to heed your speeches with all seriousness. Before the section, Camille amusingly raised a cup with 2 fingers and portrayed a concentrated look. Then the attention about taking out and taking out Wendy leisurely and majestically put her palm down on the table and said in such a solemn tone that both of them could hardly restrain themselves from laughing. However, they loved to bring each other humor to exalted moods, the joy of laughter, but at the same time to hold back and as long as possible do not go into a prolonged laughter. Okay, here's the scheme. Is such a scheme from sipped more coffee. Wendy slightly moved the cup to gesture more comfortably over the table. There are 7 basic checker. There definitely are, but there's also like a physical body. A case of saying little beyond that. Don't be shy, Camille said. But the bodies are different for aunts and uncles. And what do we see? Asked Wenduja. We see a table, but is it really there? Apparently, the Baltic screws, or rather, nuts, in general, convexly and convexly these. Now this is all a joke to you, of course, but look closely. There's the young, the hara, the lower chakra. What do we know that's convex? There's finally some understanding. That's right. And underneath, our bodies are convex and bulging. They both laughed and paused for a few minutes to catch their breath and to sip the sweet and strong coffee that sent shivers down the back of their necks. Wendy continued with, this is what a hammer is. Chakra. That's right. The main chakra that conducts like energy, vitality, the most basic and gross, survival itself. And who are the most defiant? Rats, cockroaches. No, men. That's a bit controversial. How about Africans or homeless people? Camille asked. The toughest living men, that's why they have a bulge. And we're right. What's higher? If you're talking about genitalia. Well, let's take the breasts theme even further. You won't be bored. It's a real pleasure and a bit of a thrill, said Camille. Now on the subject of arousal, Wendy continued. Who are the sexiest, kind of attractive and passionate girls? That's right. And that's why if you look at the part that decent young ladies can only call babes in the kitchen and in the company of a friend, you'll see that with us young ladies it's kind of bulging. It's anatomy. But in men it's at least flat. Why is that? Maybe it's an anatomy thing. Of course it is, but at the energetic level, at the level of subtle anatomy, we have this center more developed. So we are so passionate and creative. And men, well, how would you see a sexy male striptease or a dance in general? Jim Carrey and Masons know, but it's certainly Trump. Heh. But seriously, okay, let's go higher. Like higher, more and everywhere, we see this kind of connection. My stomach's got to go. The will, the activity to push something through, to save, to gather, to build. Yes, women have a belly, but it is not from the belly. It's the previous chakras of the Saint of Houston. It's the mani. The abdominal muscles and stuff are more developed in men, especially since you've noticed that bosses are more likely to be chubby guys, and a lot of people are attracted to that. Not me and not me, but I'm kind of attracted to one client. She told me about her fetish, by the way. Wendy used to give psychological trainings on the internet, and by the way, she has a thing for bossy, strong-willed men. You know, the kind of, domestic comfort and stability. I'm just now realizing that. But as they say, it all adds up. Sherlock, your method never fails. You've unlocked the mystery of being through the convex stuff of a cavity. And to expand the matter seriously, said Wendy, listening to you with the utmost seriousness, replied Camille. So, moving higher and see that everything is correct, as they say in decent society. Flipboards. Obama, but hear about the exchange you kind of accurately said. Basically, the breasts are at the level of sheet hut. That's why we're so loving. We kind of have it right out there. I'm so drunk on coffee, it's kind of sticking out. Camille. Wendy looked Camille in the eye and put her hand on her palm. Camille tried to tease Wendy at the look with her own, as if even deeper and matter-of-factly loving, and both laughed. But men also have a kind of like. Camille kept nodding along to the chi-chai. Like I'm talking about the natural order. And in that order, we have it, and they don't. Why? Because we're more developed, and we're so tender and loving. And men are kind of boo-boos, not emotional in general, without tenderness. And we're carriers. Carriers, yeah, carriers of breasts. And under these breasts, we give love on an energetic level. But we sign for what? For iPhones. It's kind of funny. It's actually for the next chakra. Because the jokes were what? That's right, the Adam's apple. So the energy from us below goes above. And now men give us from the grid. That is such a subtle creation of feeling. You've noticed that all sorts of creative guys love big scarves and things like that. Camille nodded. That's kind of a sign of the elaborate joke they're covering up and spreading. Basically, what you're saying is that there's an exchange of energies from the bottom. We give to the men, we give to the top, and so on. For example, did they protect us from predators or bring meat to the cave? We give the men sexuality at the level of the fight, the camp. They enjoy it and feed off of it. We are not the couple at whose expense the house is built and status creates our comfort. We fill the house, sweat and love give tenderness at the expense. And at the hut they transform that love into high creative ideas and give them jokes. Camille, give me the credit. Do you want more coffee? No, let's go for a walk to my place. And we'll walk with Jenna too. Only I have a professor for you. Dear Wendy, one more question. Where's the upper chakra? Okay, but not on the way. Then we'll go to Rainbow Smile. I need to see something there. Regarding your question, Wendy matter-of-factly corrected her large glasses without Desperas, which she bought because it's sexy and also ironic, and looked at Camille sideways. You make all the right points. There is a third eye, or as we real Hindus say, that's good. Above it, 1,000 lotus petals blossom on the top of the head. You want to know if there's a trade. I want to go to the bathroom more. I'm gonna run. You talk. I can hear everything. Camille got up and went to the restroom next to the kitchen. Well, my Lakshka, I will reveal to you the truth that there is no exchange on these. There are only higher realms and independent progress. Then what's the point? Speak. I hear you. Camille went to wash her hands. The point is that you create a harmonious unity and then rise with knowledge as if by yourself to the higher worlds. No, my shampoo is new. Wendy shouted the shampoo phrase louder. Camille came to the kitchen with a bottle in her hands and, sitting down, began to read the composition of the same. Honey did not see the most important thing. Well, Camille abruptly broke away from reading and walked over to her friend. Funny. Insistent stare. No need to get so worked up. Wendy adjusted her glasses again. Everything has its turn. You haven't considered or asked, of course, what happens when you lack energy on some level. It's known to be debauchery and drugs. Well, you're right. Wendy's tired of playing the professor. All sorts of deviance and disharmony sets in. Anyway, to make a long story short, let's go pack. If one level is lacking, the next level is also bad. For example, if a man hasn't built a house or achieved anything, the girlfriend doesn't give him love. By the way, the logic is vulgar, but money can really kind of buy the tenderness and love of the manipulator. It is, after all, money, the ability for money to accumulate and own. Sure, it's vulgar sounding, but it's essentially an exchange of energies. In general, you mean that in a normal couple everything is harmonious and such a mutual exchange. And if there is not enough of something, then there will be imbalance or balance on the side. Give me the credit. Clearly understood. How's that sound? It makes sense, and you can't argue with anatomy. Oh, and I'm gonna need that anatomy flash drive. Why do you want me to watch it tonight? It's in my living room somewhere right now. What about you and Sebastian? There's no imbalance anywhere. Yeah, it seems fine. She's not running around looking for balance on the side. Walks, long walks. Camille used to go out with Wendy as much as possible in her spare time, but she got bored with it. And Camille wasn't enough. She discussed various sad news stories, which she watched with as much indifference as she talked about them. But Wendy was getting bored with these conversations. It seemed that her friend had become too cynical. Camille, however, was not cynical. Her personality type was not inclined to cynicism at all. It was just the bland taste that bothered her for some reason. "Maybe I'm less of a problem," she asked Wendy. "Or maybe there's more money," she asked. "But that too. That's my soul getting fat in ridiculous comfort. You know, I'm getting good money for tutoring. It's kind of like a kind of income for fun now. I mean, if you look at my previous living conditions, I've never been more comfortable." "In a way it is," Wendy replied. "If you were my client, I would tell you that we have been fearful creatures for centuries, hundreds of thousands of years, trying to survive in a harsh jungle, and now we can enjoy comfort. Therefore, the search for suffering or adventure is a purely logical process for us that we should not be frightened of. We should curb this urge, turn it into a tool for the realization of tendencies that are useful for us. If you, Wendy, were to give me such nonsense in a session, I would lose faith in people and in the training of professional psychologists." Wendy playfully got into a fighting stance, as if defending her skills. Camille copied her stance. They laughed and walked further down the fall street. "The world is starting to turn yellow," Camille said, looking at the crowns that had recently begun to turn yellow in gaps in their emerald temple. "You know, I think maybe the devil has forsaken me." "More details, please," about Wendy's cheerfully amused tone, and looked at her friend, eyes bulging a little. "But you know, a lot of people say that it's a problem to lose religion, or that you'll be left by some kind of God presence. Well, I don't think you have to worry about that. First of all, there is nothing you can do, and if you think logically, what kind of worries can there be about it? The devil is another matter. If he tempts you or hinders you in some way, then you are definitely, well, or with high probability, a good person. But if he left you, why should you be afraid? Everything is clear with you. You don't need to be tempted." "That's an interesting thought. Who did you read it from?" "Yes, I didn't read it myself. I'm thinking about problems, about their absence, about fat comfort, and strange hopelessness. I think maybe that's the problem." "Yeah, girlfriend, you're not talking to a psychologist. You're talking to a theologian. Are you suggesting we go to church?" They both looked at each other. "Okay, I don't want to burden you. I'm gonna go talk to the German girl about soap operas. Maybe intellectual fast food makes your soul fatter," asked Wendy. "Maybe the question is whether she can marry at all. The question is whether you remain attractive." "The question is beside the point," replied Camille, "since Sebastian can't reach me or see me there, as probably no one else can. Okay, bye. Bye, Sebastian. Hi." In the evening, Camille watched the show in the armchair with her, and she spent the week with Sebastian on her free days, so they didn't go out much. Except sometimes, they hung around the house and went to cafes to sit in the company of other people, to show their presence in the world. They often walked to the parking lot together, and usually ate at home before work. Sebastian worked as a contractor in construction, and due to his malleable style had good orders and good income. In this field, a lot depends on government contracts. Everyone is tied to the budget in one way or another. That is why those who work for patriotism are successful. It is necessary to express loyalty to everything from thoughts, bosses, and decisions of large developers, to news about new bills and the next successes in the geopolitical arena. At the same time, loyalty should be expressed ahead of time. That is, before it is necessary to formally confirm one's allegiance to the party's course. Sebastian was good at this. Moreover, he understood for himself who he was. In the Soviet era, such a person would have been called a sycophant. But Sebastian was good at this dish called outer loyalty. He really knew how to play the good guy. In a way, being good at everything. And if you didn't really deal with his ideas, you couldn't mess with them. And the country and business always needs a good guy like that. Sebastian was good at his estate, in fact, and it was because of his image that he was able to build a relationship with Camille. He understood Camille's psychology well, and understood her instincts and impulses in many ways better than she did herself. He did not want to put things into words or think about them. Sebastian only sensed when to let Camille be frightened and then to calm her down. He knew in front of whom and in what situation to play the cool driver, and when to look at everyone with arrogance and squeamishness, as if external conditions did not concern him at all, and he was above mediocre experiences. Always he framed his reactions and behavior in a way that made him look winning. And this strategy had an effect. Of course, if you take apart all these techniques on paper, try to reflect on who Sebastian is, who he is. If you take apart his movements individually, it's obvious that the guy is a hypocrite at best. Though even so, one could not raise a hand to condemn him, as they say. After all, Sebastian, like so many other people, actually wanted happiness for himself. A little ridiculous, but can we reproach a man who strives for happiness? The problem was that if all these techniques were used consistently, and Sebastian created a story about his person, built an image in front of another person, then these charms were difficult to detect. He looked more than harmonious and cool, so he could charm Camille, who only after a couple of years of life together discovered these details of the game in him, but did not judge and accuse him. She stopped at the fact that he was trying for their relationship after all. Similarly, she treated the new arrival of her spouse during trips to the parking lot. The parking lot they used was about 10 minutes from the house at a new apartment complex, but it was a prestigious parking lot, like in a cool American movie. Sebastian had gotten a couple of spaces on favorable terms through his connections, and he liked to use this parking lot as a status symbol. As they drove through the floors, they saw expensive cars. There were serious, solid people walking around in the building with their serious business. Everyone liked to feel a part of it. He, too, was a respectable man who could afford such a parking lot. On the way, they talked about work, looked at passers-by, and discussed them over the Sina. Jigurda kept almost nodding toward the sturdy guy with long hair at the bus stop. Here is a man who has and feels the inner core picked up. And Camille, they smiled and continued to joke about the people they saw. Look, a rental. Didn't look like they took it out. It's a drive-through, though. Sebastian nodded at the windows, having recently closed. U.S. Farms. The sauce is like sour cream. Camille replied. It's kind of an anti-flavor. Yeah, it's a talent to ruin a dish that's almost impossible to ruin. It takes a lot of effort. Camille echoed the same sentiment. It's a good thing they closed. This is what their typical dialogue looked like. Before work, a pleasant chat, meaningfully similar to a song about everything you see. Camille not often, but often said something serious. She would get carried away with her words, and her eyes would sometimes hide. As in the first days of their acquaintance, Sebastian tried to look, and even be brutal and serious, but at the same time as if he were not a tense master of the situation. One morning as they moved leisurely down a warm fall street, Sebastian, behind his vacillating coolness, did not hide not only himself, as a good actor hides himself before the audience, but also his discontent, as he often hides in public. Almost every person who believes that in society you should maintain a general degree of normality and calmness and not worry the space with your worries. Sebastian was worried about the lack of morning intimacy, which he didn't insist on, but still strived hard enough to get, and in the end, he got from Camille. Only hope for the next time they were together. The thing is, the need was part of his image of a cool life, which unexpected morning intimacy between spouses is something romantic, and Camille saw this option as the same need as the morning toilet, just wrapped in a veneer of fake aesthetics. Camille understood that it was not a matter of intimacy, but of wanting, in fact, to go to the bathroom as well. It had been wanting since the morning. She understood that there was much more physiology to it, so unobtrusively dismissed gradually the claims of a sweet morning. Sebastian knew, however, that he would have a sweet morning anyway. Let's go take a look. He pointed to a new coffee shop that had been opened where the farm used to be. Nastya immediately understood what was going on and didn't argue. Of course, let's go. We're a coffee shop. We need to know the nearest points. On the one hand, they really both drank coffee regularly. On the other hand, they drank a cup of coffee in the morning, sometimes in coffee houses, and sometimes they took a strong cup of instant coffee with condensed milk. Before watching movies experientially, they found that the effect allowed them to go deeper into the movie, to relax their bodies almost completely, but still reflect on the picture. Did Camille often have coffee with Wendy or before the end of her shift at work with her friends? The coffee jolts, however, were clearly an exaggeration. Not to say that they couldn't do without these effects at all and were somehow addicted to coffee drinks. For Sebastian in general, the cup was more often important because the cup was a symbol of a cool modern guy who goes about some important business with this cup, and with a sip the cup gave a pleasant feeling. With each sip it made Sebastian feel good. He felt especially good when he managed to show up in front of someone with a cup of coffee. There were a lot of coffee shops on the way to the parking lot. They lived in a dense, built-up part of town, in a large apartment complex, near a lot of transit stops, all kinds of buildings. And Sebastian started stopping in occasionally on his way out for another drink, reasoning that he wasn't awake. Camille knew he wanted to walk coolly to his car in the parking lot with a drink in one hand and a key fob in the other, and that someone important and serious who uses this respectable parking lot would see him like that. It wasn't the first time Camille had made jokes about coffee junkies. Only this time, she knew Sebastian wanted to flirt some more with the young barista they had seen there earlier. She knew that Sebastian wanted to prove to himself that basically, he could pick anyone at all and give himself a sweet morning. He could, but he didn't really want to. At least he didn't take a croissant, Camille thought as they approached the parking lot. The thing is, Sebastian saw his ideal image not only walking with a cup of coffee, but also sitting down with a croissant. First of all, Sebastian liked to chew, and it seemed that the world becomes more pleasant when you chew something tasty on the go. Secondly, he thought it made the space more his own and himself more spontaneous. The ridiculous thing was that Sebastian was sort of unobtrusively adjusting to the situation, and he wasn't particularly hungry. He did, however, enjoy taking the croissant course past the security guard's booth in the parking lot. To see another customer stepping out of the elevator and nod a little taking a bite of his bun. Camille had long understood these movements of his inner world and outer behavior, but believed that if one wanted to make a man feel comfortable, why forbid it if it is happiness for him? She thought, why reshape it? It would be ridiculous to arrange a clarification of relations on this topic. The family budget allowed to go to the cafe in the morning, and in general everyone liked it. Should we be worried? Especially Sebastian himself could hardly admit to his little fetish. Probably for him, such a thing would be a serious problem as for an actor who was exposed on stage and now awaits some frightening unknown. Sebastian-like. Eating my croissant in public and feeling cool. It was a thought Camille had come to terms with, though sometimes thinking about it and watching him, if not frightening, seemed to expose some strange thoughts. When Sebastian bit into his croissant at the perfect moment, for example, after a serious phrase he had said on the phone, and when he was noticed by another person, and Sebastian looked solid and businesslike, but at the same time as if he were his own guy with a bun. He looked, if he didn't bite the gentleman by the beard, he was definitely tugging at some sensitive part of the world that might be giving the average man some tasty and useful juice. Probably the teat of some peaceful world cow that nourishes all living things. But if one pressed a little on the bite, then with the milk would flow the blood of that cow. And it seemed that Sebastian, with such prizes in front of the invisible, but more real, at least for him, than the visible reality of the auditorium. After all, it was not only the oncoming person who looked at him, but the world in general wants to achieve just that. Over Kosovo does not want to commune with this blood because he thinks that something true and something at least happy is hiding from him, hiding somewhere in other people's lives, in beautiful movies. But if he will persistently gnaw into this world, trying not to show outwardly, so that he could not be denounced in these gnawing and trotting, He will achieve that happiness with him, that the audience will stop watching so closely and will begin to admire, if not every, then most of the movements of his life, words, and a beautiful, honest look that looks into the world, as if Ryan Gosling from the screen, when Camille these reprisals too frightening or tiring. She could cut a situation short with a mocking phrase or a look. Of course, she tried to do such things gently and didn't mean to hurt feelings at all. She rationed this exposure so that she could only destroy that strange aura of movie happiness and bring him back to reality. Reality he didn't like. At least the kind where he couldn't help but compulsively bite off similar bits and pieces of bread. For from the fancy glass, he understood what Camille was doing, but he could not admit it even to himself. For if he confessed, the meaning of his emerging urges would be revealed. He would be uncovered and discovered beneath the slenderness of all seemingly such natural behavior. His soft smoked with cheese on the butter of life will turn into a harsh, unpredictable, and rough reality, even if he already every day rubs on our duck and only managed to convince himself about the butter and cheese, so to speak, to merge his own mind in this illusion wanted to believe and did not want to destroy. That's why every attempt on his strictly planned and in some way even long-suffered fairy tale of his happiness by Camille was remembered and postponed as an unexpected deception and danger. Let Camille in reality restrain him from deception, above all from deceiving himself. But he didn't like it and wanted to play it cool and eat a croissant and coffee on the way to work to look cool. Sebastian generally tried to live his life to look perfect, and his logic was that if you always look cool, you will be or already are cool. If you behave like a happy person, you look happy. That is, you'll be happy in the end. Sebastian didn't want to be happy, so he was always afraid of being late for happiness, late for life. This peculiarity of his manifested itself in many ways. He chose a fashionable hobby, which someone began to be interested in, tried to bypass or overtake his acquaintances in something even in small things like this manifested itself. For example, when he saw one of the guys in the parking lot in the morning, one of the guys they had glimpsed in the company office, when they saw each other in a coffee shop nearby or on the road when they arrived in the evening after work, Sebastian always wanted to pull out of the parking lot first. He and Camille usually walked leisurely in the mornings, but if one of the guys you knew showed up, he would naturally but insistently and actively speed up to get to the car and start as fast as he could. Although on other days he could first walk Camille to her compact sedan to look at the car, a little chat, wish her a good day, and only then go to her car. It was similar in the manner of communication, in the choice of opinions, behavior, hobbies. Sebastian aspired to the place where he thought it was possible to look happy and feel happiness, which, by the way, was illustrated by a famous proverb. But Sebastian believed that, in the end, it should still become good where he is, and sometimes really captured moments of inner harmony and very sublime feeling when he thought that everything in this world, in this life he has cool, and he himself can be an example of a good and happy man. As we know, every man strives for happiness. Wendy did her professional wise owl look, although Camille, having watched a couple of recordings of her online trainings, called this characteristic technique cheap hypnosis and slowed down the speech literally for a second, so that the client caught up not only the meaning of the words, but also emotionally energetic message. The current Dalai Lama states that, in a sense, all living beings strive for happiness, and that is the natural process. You see, we cannot deny that human beings want to not suffer. Moreover, our inner suffering can be much more significant and sensitive than our outer suffering. That's why you make an appointment with me. Sit down in front of a laptop screen to talk about your problems. Talk it through. As a way to get out of your misery, to understand the cause and eliminate them if you want. Perhaps consider them in a different way. We psychologists are modern-day shamans, that is, soul healing specialists, and you are ordinary people. Come to us to talk the problem out. Vanessa, if you find it therapeutic, use this kind of magical interpretation, Consider our sessions as conspiring problems. You know how the witches in the villages could heal all kinds of pain. Wendy realized that a large mug of coffee had to be brewed. Talking this time was more involved than usual. In most sessions, she gave a set of 3 true questions, and the patient client would talk at length about herself, and she would listen and sometimes throw directly to the camera. A thoughtful and sharp look, creating a very effective illusion of understanding and presence. Once, for fun, she even discreetly played Kennedy in a session. But to do such a thing again was not allowed. The categorical imperative and moral law within her. And the sweet Irish coffee, parting, glanced up at her from the bottom of the cup, waiting for the last sip. Not easy both sips, thought Wendy, and began to remember a recent Scandinavian movie about how people lack always a small portion of alcohol in the blood. And if this level is maintained, it is possible to achieve a feeling of permanent happiness, at least on a hormonal level. Clearly, the heroes of the movie. School teachers first sang on the idea of testing the thesis, and then got drunk. And some of them even got fired. But who can fire her? And she sits in her underwear with legs, in a basin of warm water to think better, but at the same time not to strain, speaks, and for every word she says, she gets good money. At the same time, she is paid not so much for her words as for the time she fills with those words. That is, timing is important. In the art of stretching it, Wendy would be the envy of Dumas himself, who was paid by the lines, and so he loved to spell out dialogues with phrases of a couple of words. Long dialogues, which probably pleased many school children that the pages of such books are read much faster. And you don't have to think about the dialogues. Wendy once thought about it and noticed that a lot depends on the content. After all, somewhere in a century wrote Hemingway, and also often used dialogue in places phrases, but he had many meanings buried under each word, which were revealed in a motley kaleidoscope. It was worth only the reader to look into these words under the phrases of Dumas were buried under the coins that he received for each line, and probably his own vanity of yet another smart guy who had managed, as they say, to screw the system. Wendy considered himself a faithful continuer of the telesystem's traditions, and in some ways even saw his own person as a part of the privileged community, if not the chosen one. Wendy used quite legitimate therapeutic techniques, which corresponded to the methods of her work. Repeating the question once, asking her to describe feelings, and analyzing emotions. Nevertheless, in fact, a substantial part of the session may have consisted, for example, of a dream question. Do you think so? And a detailed response from the client, and a follow-up question. Now, do you really think so? To which Wendy would of course add a meaningful look. And if she realized that the client, as they say, does not particularly understand, could in combination with a look to take the soul of glasses and slightly shift them down, making as if a smart teacher's look from behind. Essentially, real and honed. Wendy's professional skills consisted of being able to pinpoint exactly who she was with. Such a technique was possible to use. And for whom should it be used? Only a deep and thoughtful gaze, which was required while being really diligent in filling it with emotion, sincerity, and empathy. Analyzing emotions was one of the respected methods for Wendy, being not only a woman, but also a very popular and experienced commercial psychologist, knew that women were happy, indeed, especially in confidence, to talk about their own feelings. Not all of them, but of her clients and in general of those who used the services of psychologists, almost all of them. So there was always an opportunity to turn the session into a mixture of therapeutic meditation combined with the use of psychotherapeutic techniques. Wendy would set clear tasks, for example, to talk about the colors of the emotions the client was experiencing. After that, she could tell a little esoteric detail about thought forms and the presence of each thought-emotion bundle. Real appearance, which could be fixed by people, if it were not for the limitations of their perception. After that, it was possible to ask a lot of repeated questions about emotions, work through feelings colored in different colors, and much more. The point was that clients liked this kind of thing, and were eager to engage in stories about the color of their own feelings and the variety of experiences. That said, the clients, unlike Wendy, were generally unaware that the more one talked about feelings, the more words and details would appear in addition to her professional inventory. It stretches the timing, and as if not quite legal, but generally acceptable and quite useful successors. Try saying each word leisurely. Feel your speech and feel what you've filled those words with. Long and meaningful stares into the camera. Concentrate on the breath of silent meditation. Of course, Wendy would not allow herself to suggest silent meditation for the entire session. But if it got tiring and she didn't know how to end it, she doubted it would have a good effect. At the end of the session, she offered to meditate on what had been said and portrayed full inclusion in the process. Outwardly, this inclusion was expressed by sitting with closed eyes and wrinkled eyebrows in front of the camera. Although she had acquaintances who were already putting together online meditation groups and practicing for at least an hour at a time, collecting a good income, some objected that scolding such gatherings was not the point, and the point is to be present and silently concentrate. To which Wendy logically parried that such practices are also available in elevators, public transport, queues, and traffic jams. And unbeknownst to her, perhaps the company of much more conscious citizens will be nearby, and the effect of silent concentration, accordingly, should be of higher quality. The quality of life is largely determined by the quality of one's inner state. Wendy stopped remembering the Scandinavian movie and sad about not yet up to coffee. What do you need 1 million for expensive sneakers if you have no feet? But what are your feet for? If you don't want to run, you don't know where to go. If you're confused, what do you use the tastier food for? If you are annoyed about nothing, will you enjoy the attention of a beau? If you are rubbing ridiculous reproaches out of yourself, Wendy knew there were still about 10 minutes left. During her sessions, she purposely didn't look at the time so that she could be fully engaged in the integrity of the process and not be distracted, and set a timer to report back. But the problem: Vanessa, a sales rep from Ugra, was not presenting a problem. How to solve it? At the same time, Vanessa was a valued customer from all sides, a wealthy and status provincial who was good at her job. But from the field of psychology, she knew only the TV series Deceive Me, which she did not watch, preferring popular comedies or series about brave special forces or something similar. Clearly, you want to choose one of your girlfriends. First of all, there is an internal conflict. In addition, you must competently use their resources emotional. There's a lot of meaningful looks here too. And realize that you have one life, one you, and you want to be happy. Which, as we have found out through many examples, is well worth striving for. Which is quite normal, you know. Wendy, you make a good point, but it's the very question of that choice that concerns me. You're right to speak for me. No one can make me happy or do the inner work. A woman with a fake tan, a large face and large parts on it with the look of a trusting sheepdog, and an expensive necklace looked at Wendy from the screen. But it's hard to choose, isn't it? We've been friends for so long. And you say we have to decide. No, Vanessa, look, you're the one talking. And you know, you and I are just actualizing your intentions in words. I mean, we're expressing in speech what you have, but you're not saying. You yourself know that you should choose one of your friends for further communication and cut down on communication with the other one. Only in this way you will be able to build your career normally and be, as they call it, in the resource. Wendy, I remember you said that in order to build something, you need to destroy something. But is it worth destroying a relationship like this? It seems a bit far-fetched to me right now. Vanessa, I had a similar situation. In general, there shouldn't be such frankness between us. But I'll tell you in a friendly way. Wendy did not want to strain herself and thought of a way to end the session smoothly. I also had two friends, Nancy Vysotskaya and Evelyn. They and I were in psychology school when we had to write our thesis. I was able to make good points with each of them. But Nancy was not the best influence on the zone of my immediate development as a scholar and professional. Evelyn, when she once had a seizure right in our faculty lab, told me to take the necessary measurements. I was writing a paper on psychophysiological traits at the time, and I had to go to hospitals to take these measurements for my thesis. What was difficult? Evelyn thought first of all not about herself, but about me. And then, by the way, when I visited her, she herself offered to make the measurements I needed, which was much more convenient than recruiting an experimental base with unknown people. And in the hospital, she got to know the other wards. Only for what? Right, so she could take measurements when I visited her. Who do you think I kept in touch with after my master's program? Probably Evelyn. Vanessa responded to Wendy's expressive stare by staring at her from the screen. Right? The question was rhetorical. Wendy continued enthusiastically, as she knew the timer was close. I've been in touch with Evelyn further, and we have a good experience with each other. Enriching each other, you know, exchanging energies. You have a similar situation, and you know the criteria of choice, and you can quite easily make an analogy from my story and draw conclusions about your inner contradictions about it. Let us look at the ideas of inner integrity that we see in the so-called Jungian notebooks. You've probably heard of him. I've heard of him, but I haven't read him. I just know Carl Jung, answered Vanessa. A pleasant melody from a mixture of gongs and Tibetan bowls sounded. Then you'll know. I offer you a convenient and productive elective. I will record you a short lecture on the South. In the context of your problem, your task is to listen at your leisure and analyze your own methods about what you hear. We can move the new session a bit if you need more time, or we can call as always and discuss it, given that I will record the lecture especially for you, and I will have to work through the material additionally. The lecture will go as the cost of 2 sessions, but I strongly advise you. Of course, Wendy, I remember it's a psychological mechanism, and when we pay a lot, we value the product more. I remember, Wendy. Vanessa smiled and nodded. Okay, well, I don't feel comfortable distracting you from other things. I'll have the fee for the lecture and the next session in an hour. Thank you, Wendy. You should remember that the best gratitude for me is your peace of mind, development, and prosperity. So think about yourself, analyze, use our work. Bye for now. Connections then, Vanessa. If you need anything, you can always come to me. I'll be in touch. For now, Wendy smiled and waved her hand in front of the screen, then abruptly brought that hand down on the spacebar that disconnected the call. She picked up the cup with the remaining coffee with the palm of her hand and finished the rest of it with relish. She looked up at the bookshelf behind the computer screen, from where Vygotsky's spines looked back at her, and raised the cup again, nodding at the books and as if drinking to them, sweetly lingering and about the gray in her head with the pads of her fingers. Wendy realized she wanted to make herself a cocktail and call Camille into the kitchen. She picked up a thick-bottomed glass. She thought about the fact that if the bottom was thick enough, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to break through. Grinned at that thought, and half full a bottle of Black Label from where she poured some into the glass. Took a sweet syrup from the shelf. Picked the yellowest lemon in the fridge and squeezed some into the glass. Greased off a cut slice of it around the rim. Wendy knew how to make different cocktails, but they rarely drank with Camille because the two of them were already having fun together. Wendy wasn't much fun on her own, and her ability to make delicious cocktails helped her to ignore this very obvious reality. The lemon version of the cocktail was almost ready. She added some ice and Essentuki on top, and once again realized that someday God would not protect her, and she would still be tempted to start a social network account, where she would start posting her variations of famous cocktails with her own author's recipes, as well as selfies of walks in combination with clever captions, words, and liquids. She was good at getting in the way of telling it. Internet space got in the way of socializing with Camille, who had a snobbish attitude toward almost everyone who hosts social media. The only exceptions for her were business accounts and the pages of any publicists. Wendy wanted to keep a level head and didn't give in to the urge to pour her skills of pouring tasty concoctions into her tummies and other minds on the internet. She sat comfortably in her computer chair and dialed Camille over the video link. From the thick-bottomed glass loaves, she had prepared one of the standard bonjour greetings. Who was he? An owl, as Camille herself sat in her cozy leather chair with her laptop on her hips, pondering on the scale of my own popularity on the scale of the world by my one insignificant grain of sand. But on the scale of one's own account, we can be very matter-of-fact and businesslike. Let's make an account for Jenna. I'll edit with him. Then we'll go to advertising, split the profits. When you say that you're not happy with the work, you want to talk about it. Wendy? Why do you understand people? And the trainings on how to understand yourself are given by me. Camille moved in the spacious and soft chair, smiled, and began in the playfully humorous tone they usually use to speak in. You see, Wendy, life is a school where everyone should learn their own lessons. The famous proverb says, we learn by teaching. That's right, Captain School. Wendy clinked her glass with the camera screen and took a little swig. If you'll excuse me, I'll continue. Camille spoke in a serious tone, although I was now also hungry for something. Wait a second. The screen changed to show the side tab of the chair. Camille's stomping and Jenna's footsteps could be heard, apparently walking somewhere near the chair. Camille came running in with a bottle of kefir and a large slice of sweet summer, from which she had somehow managed to take a big bite on her way to the chair. She continued to chew it deliciously. Roulette Poison munched on the kefir, occasionally making Wendy a funny grimace with an ethereal mustache. Thus, Camille choked a little. Summer pounded her chest powerfully a couple times and continued talking. Thus, life experience itself allows for, as strange as it may sound, you know. Life experience. Assuming that this reality is conceived by someone immensely wise, or at least speculating that there is some global mechanism that somehow moves and controls this reality, we can assume that reality allows you to experience the version of events that you are missing. Going back to our proverb, by teaching we learn, we can assume that teaching or mentoring is the best way for one's learner to learn. Accordingly, the person who already knows about people does not need to learn. Okay, Camille, don't go out. There's a cute bartender on the next street over. He's working now. Come on, help us get acquainted and make romance between us like real love. You mean a movie or some real love you want to create? I mean a movie to make a real and secret love with this Borman. After all, what is our life, a movie? Or a book of life? Or generally a short story published on the side of the internet? But why so belittle our value? It's a little too sullenly Camille to steer and drink from a bottle of kefir. Situational drinks make you sad. You're better off with kefir. It makes me feel like Sturlitz. But I'm not going out. Well, I will, but not with you. Now, Wendy was talking through her laughter. Where do you think you're going? Honey, I'm not going anywhere. I'm gonna go play with Jenna. Seriously, Wendy, I'm not in the mood. I want to go out on my own. I'll come by your place one of these days. Come on, smack the not-so-cute ram for me. You're welcome to go out on your own. I'll go to the movies then, shall I? Wendy smiled and waved to her friend. She made a sad face about the lack of a common walk and pressed the space bar. A desktop appeared in front of her with a screensaver of cartoon meditates and capillaries. The indicator light on the camera went out. Camille closed the laptop and moved in her chair, shifting her hips. Wendy was on the phone. Sebastian came in from the bedroom where he sat at the computer. She called, asking me to go for a walk, but I'm not going with her. Come with me and I won't go with you. I want to walk and be quiet. We can be quiet. No, don't be angry. Camille realized that her husband might see in her refusal a continuation of the morning and begin to worry, which was not at all desirable. But also to continue this conversation slowly slipping into absurdity. Neither wanted to, nor did she want to go with anyone but the trusty Basta. Gathering for a walk, Camille once again thought how she adored the Bass. It is unknown what exactly attracted in this appearance. Probably the melancholy expression on his face, which reminded her of an office clerk. Perhaps she liked the fact that they had such a long, low torso on short legs, which they amusingly shuffled. Probably liked the huge ears and aristocratic spats that expressed some kind of steady seriousness. She called Jenna out for a walk, pulled on her cozy fall voluminous down jacket, put on her snowboarding pants to stay warm for sure, and headed outside. Camille decided for herself that looking at passers-by and at home was much more useful than looking at the news with indifference, or out the window or at the wall, especially as she walked with such a focused gaze, sometimes only taking in some faces. Otherwise, she was more beholden to the bigger picture. As of late, she had started to like to take a lot of walks, going out with Jenna, and for an hour or two at a time, to pick out roughly where to go, and through the houses and people, picking up some curious details, contemplating her own thoughts. After such walks, it became much better. There was less apathy, and the world seemed less monotonous and confined only to work and her relationship with Sebastian and her friends. Most of all, she liked to invent neighborhoods made up of paneled houses around evening, when the bulk of the residents had just arrived at their dwellings or were already settling in for dinner. It was getting dark outside, and the houses were warm, with a pleasant light and the feeling that people had come in after work and were now sitting with their loved ones, eating warm food, drinking warm drinks, talking about something pleasant. Camille looked into these windows from the street and thought about hundreds of different lives and destinies, the peculiarities of these people, and how strange it is that they live so close to each other with their very different lives. But in the evenings, almost every apartment is filled with warm light, which can be felt in the cool autumn street. At the same time, the succession of windows always seemed sad. More precisely, there was a feeling that is commonly called light sadness. There was something pleasant and reassuring about these paneled houses and their windows, but there was also something dreary, sometimes unbearably dreary. Camille literally burst into tears as she immersed herself in these feelings. She thought that these high-rises were full of some unbearable lyricism, more poignant than the lines of the most sensitive poets. Maybe, she thought, it's some kind of sum total of all experiences. These houses have their own tragedies, their own sadness. Someone died in them, and others were sad about it. Someone broke up and quarreled, and then they were sad too. Some were probably mad or deeply mistaken, and the whole world was sad about it. But there were also joys and amazing insights. Many people always came to their homes every day to be near their loved ones again. There were many people who loved each other and, if possible, all other people. Maybe that's what makes up some of the sum total. And so there is a mixture of joy and sadness, and there's such a shared flavor of human life, such a light sadness. Can poets do anything useful at all? If it's enough to walk around and look at the windows lit from within, they can try to broadcast that feeling. To make us, for example, Camille pondered sadly as she continued to wander the window-lit streets. But it's only about imitating something. Sometimes it's about the goods that are going to be sold to us, and that's where I can understand the deal. For example, I've beaten the head of the department, but I'm a workaholic, and always in reserve about the work of deputies, because of course not everyone is as smart as me. And I also go to all sorts of boring seminars, and I don't have time to go and stare at faces in windows. And someone offers me such an emotional commodity. Not directly, of course, offers, but it is clear to me that I buy a subscription on a book or serial site and start reading or watching a melodrama, because I know that the end of a melodrama is always tragic, and I want to feel the sadness of empathizing with the characters as well. But in essence, what am I doing? I'm kind of giving into these emotions. Or with that one, she turned to herself. And indeed, she stood in the middle of the street, thought, looked at the week, and walked slowly again. After all, when I look out of the windows, I too eat something, or what? I eat something too. No, I guess not really. You can't eat a beautiful landscape. How do you feel about it? That's not my attitude. I walk and look, and even perhaps I try not to disturb this harmony, not to touch it even with a glance, and even less to dig into it. But art that is for sale is eaten in a sense. It is a product that can be bought and sold. Camille stopped looking at the graffiti on the wall of the house, and in this case, it is not a direct feeling that is sold, but an indirect one, which someone has experienced in something packaged and made available. But that is not what is important, but the fact that such feelings are saturating, but they are attractive. Perhaps, Camille continued to ponder, these feelings are really tasty and something nutritious may be blood. It is said, after all, that artists write with their own blood, and someone else's blood can write. If, for example, take a lot of someone else's blood and write a picture with it, or a book or a poem, I guess someone can do that. There's probably a logic to it, though. If they buy a surrogate, they should sell a surrogate, something fake. There is logic, of course, but nothing real. Camille thought and smiled at Jenna, who was picking through her short wieners next to her. On the other hand, there's some business in it too. If something can be traded, why not trade it? The curious Protestant morality, which is said to be the basis for capitalism, suggests that it's possible to make money from trading feelings. Okay, so anyway, I realize that I can only get real feelings through my own experience. But can I so experience a work of art that the experience is identical to my own experience? I guess a lot of people treat it the same way they treat food. Camille mentioned that more than once she has noticed how her friends at work share tearful stories from popular TV series with each other and seem to be seriously worried. But in fact, they'd bring themselves to an exalted state of sadness, which is actually joyful. I guess it makes them happy that it's bad for someone else. Just like horror movies a lot of people like to watch, because there's an opportunity to get the fear while staying perfectly safe when you seem to be threatened by something, but also not threatened. Is all art, then, a sham, or is there something worthwhile? Why even look for real art? And think about it. If here, there is a succession of houses saturated with different stories and feelings, literally imbued with the very real. Wait though, thought Camille. What if the people in these houses stop being real? As if they stop feeling or start feeling not as they want and as they understand, but as it is considered necessary. What then is the nourishment of such houses? What light would come from their windows? Sometimes it barred new neighborhoods of apartment complexes, of prettier looking and more varied houses. Here too, there was occasional warmth from the windows, but something was wrong. Although Camille realized that in principle the inhabitants of panel houses and new apartment complexes were not particularly different, and the composition was roughly similar, except for some minor changes. These new houses seemed different to her. Maybe they had not yet accumulated the sum of experiences like the old houses. Nadia didn't like the high basements, which were given over to commercial space, and there were mostly liquor stores, bars, and beauty parlors. It was as if a new world was being built on this foundation, and everything seemed to be done to deceive themselves and each other. Bars to drown out the sight of grim reality, salons to hide themselves behind outward attractiveness. She saw the contented and well-dressed people who went out in the evenings to walk in the courtyards of their apartment complexes. She saw how satisfied they were with this comfortable and pleasant Watson. But the contentment seemed artificial, like Sebastian's behavior sometimes. You know, in general, I think I could use some other kind of work, but in the sense of earning money. Wendy hobbled from a tall living room glass, in which bubble and colorful liquid. For example, do you go to the store? Sebastian and I do more delivery. Every week, we sit down at the computer in our robes in the morning. It's actually more enjoyable than shopping and less impulse buying. Yeah, it's all incredibly interesting. Wendy made an establishing gesture with her hand and went on to say, but wouldn't you specifically want to save money? I don't specifically want to save money. Camille shifted in her chair to hold the laptop more comfortably, and with his other hand to stroke Natalia, lying next to him on the sofa. I have more time to spend worrying about all this, especially now that I'm earning a decent wage. Aren't you tired of it? When we took turns cooking lunches in the master's program and carrying them to the institute, I have a carefree financial fatness now, and I like not looking at prices. It feels good. Well, if you calculated how much you could save and have more money, and everything would be done for you, so we are already saving. Well, can you buy a new house? I'll let you in on a secret. We can't buy a new car. And we'll probably never be able to buy a mansion either. Unless, of course, Sebastian starts picking up government contracts. But Camille briefly wondered if she should tell Wendy the details, but realized that she already knew a lot. And best friend after all. He's too much of a coward for that. And you know what, fine. I'd rather he show off for me. There's a spell in there that'll eat my donkey right off. But I'm glad to have something to put away for my old age. I give a little money to a couple of foundations on a regular basis, and I don't have to worry. Yes. Wendy really wanted to talk about what's on her mind. It's all incredibly interesting, of course. Although, by the way, don't you think that if you had supported Sebastian H., he would have been doing a normal job there? I don't think so. Okay, whatever, Wendy went on about her own. I realized that the principle, or rather the content of the trade, must be changed. What trade? Trading with yourself, baby, for your information. I sell my face professionally, figuratively speaking. But that's the point. By the way, maybe I should put it a little more crudely, but that's not how decent ladies talk. That's right, you shouldn't. Camille smiled. Anyway, said Wendy amusedly, you've heard of joint shopping, but you've heard of it. Well, you're a genius and a certified psychologist, of course. But can that detail be an impediment to genius? Camille, you're laughing, but I've thought of everything, and I've even come up with a brand. Aggregates. Co-branding is kind of Soviet strawberry. Come on. Wendy continued laughing. Did everyone laugh at Andy Warhol, or who was ridiculed? Somebody was definitely ridiculed. That's right. I'm just saying that anyone can hurt an artist, and I'm going to work hard for you poor people, so you can buy a mansion with a barbecue area. Genius, altruist, whatever. And why should I be blessed with such a blessing as our communication? Smiled Camille, quickly presented the laptop to change the folded on the Turkish who did not have a leg. Anyway, look, I learned that this topic is very popular. Moreover, I did the math, and they're really profitable and convenient. Bought a large batch, well, let's say, millet, and distributed small. I see. Do you want to become a store? On the contrary, not a store. In a store, there are a lot of middlemen and capitalism. Mine is, more precisely, in these general purchases. The product of labor is immediately delivered to the consumer of this product. And there is a lot of logic in this and little markup. It is clear, of course, I take a part of it for myself. Well, of course, how could you not? Yes, Wendy smiled and threw a cocktail. Not without it. I saw that the main problem they have is that they have no one to gather people and tell them how great it is to buy and save money all at once. I know how to tell people things and motivate them. The nation thought I was doing a lot of good with my money. You probably bring in clients. Well, let's be serious. I mostly do it for myself with what I make. Helping psychologically is probably more effective. And it's not, shall we say, my calling. I do what I know how to do. But this skill doesn't really connect with the real essence of a psychologist's work. So I think, if it doesn't matter what I trade, maybe I should do something useful. What is everyday happiness? When there is good food in the house, or okay, here you start unhappiness, but everyday comfort, some kind of coziness. But a lot of things depend on food, right? Of course, food, water, and nice words. The three jewels. What there is in the world. And fools think gems are jewels. That's what I'm saying. And here I am, helping you buy food and water cheaply. And I say nice things, and I canvass everybody. And everyone's happy and satisfied, and with money. And I'm the director of the Oscar brand. I'd like to thank my friend Camille, who always believed in me. Wendy took the long glass with both hands like a statue. Oscar. An award for some great achievement, like solving the food problem in the country. Just ours. Or are you gonna extend that to Africa too? Very funny. Thanks for keeping my dreams alive. No, I think maybe it's okay. You do realize it's a little funny. You've got a name. You've got experience. You've got a PhD that's still being cited in publications. And you want to sell millet now. That's not what the profession is about. It's about organization and communication. Director of clinics and companies is not a toilet. What does millet have to do with it? I generally say that more primitive occupation. Nothing primitive, on the contrary, useful. Here you are also, by the way, certified personnel service, and the essential amount of work. To see if the hires start stealing from the warehouses. Okay, Wendy, you're getting personal. This isn't an argument or a sport, so you don't have to prove anything. If you think you should pursue it, you have my support. Speaking of stealing from warehouses, we've got a little thing going on here. Camille started talking about the job. They talked for about half an hour. She told me that Sebastian was going away for at least a few days on family business. His mother was ill, and he had long forgotten to visit her. Sebastian came to the metropolis from the province where his parents stayed. And after he got together with Camille, he hardly ever went to his place. Only his parents came to visit a few times on vacation. So he wanted to spend time with his mother. All the more reason to do so. There are few projects at work that can be handled online. His assistants could handle the rest. Money was okay, too, so Sebastian could take a vacation. Camille didn't connect his departure with the fact that they had some kind of misunderstanding. In fact, given her long apolitical state, she didn't feel any tension. Sebastian walked to the parking lot alone. Camille had left for work early, and he was packing his bags and sitting at his computer. He left the house close to noon and went in for coffee and croissants. Talked to a young barista about the supply of coffee from various countries, joked about Copy Dude, and modern mass culture told about the fact that the original Copy Dude was invented by American marketers who were asked to do something about unprofitable Indonesian plantations, where most of the beans were eaten by small animals and garbage. Joked about the fact that the marketers who came up with the legendary advertising move were able to buy themselves a Mustang. And not only for the rhyme, taking from the Mustang, and himself laughed about it at once. Before the made enjoyment of the characters of the advertisement to sing the first sip of cappuccino with syrup right behind the counter in front of the barista. Sebastian walked leisurely down the small street that led to the multi-story Angara parking lot that stood close to the even taller new houses and the luxury apartment complex to which the parking lot belonged. On the way, he saw one of the parking lot guys he had glimpsed, said hello. Remaining focused, the seriousness of a general pondering the recent reports from the fronts, a little really talked about common knowledge news. Nourishingly biting off a croissant between phrases and any from a glass, on and barista for laughs. Actually for the sake of the fans. And then Sebastian, really, as if by the way, stuffed a piece of paper into a jar on the counter, put in a large quantity of small contraptions and gloves with a bell that were from some kind of toy set. Did you get something? I stopped going to the gym. The boy asked Sebastian. They lived nearby and used to go to the nearest fitness center. Also saw him and Camille. Yeah, always seemed to be like that, Sebastian replied, glancing at his torso, which did tighten his shirt a bit when walking. Come on, don't stress yourself out, said the guy, indicating with a motion of his hand, his stomach. I understand it's a ball of nerves. Sebastian didn't understand the reference to popular Soviet movies and didn't really think about references and humor because he was serious and grown up. I got a lump of nerves here. Sebastian looked at the guy with complete seriousness, raised his hand, and pointed to his head. Okay, I see. The guy walked beside him for a bit, nodded to Sebastian, and walked further faster towards the parking lot entrance, leaving the serious Sebastian behind. A leisurely stroll. Camille hadn't called Wendy for a couple days. She hadn't called either. And Camille thought she might have a lot of clients, boards, a cute bartender. Or was she actually immersed in building her own brand, co-branding, co-shopping. Either way, Camille was going to stop by her place the other day. She went to work and in the evenings walked with Jenna, looking into people's eyes and into the windows of houses, thinking about the warmth in the houses she lived in from the fall wind, and watched how under the world unclothed and warm passers-by. Camille herself preferred to dress according to the principle of cabbage, that is, to use many different layers of clothing in such weather, so that really do not freeze in themselves. Recently, she had become known as a tragic cabbage when she was dressed like that. Although after her walk she felt a little better and was more of a joyful cabbage than a tragic cabbage. Walking through the poor streets, she bravely met gusts of wind. The other people, on the other hand, often felt as if they had been blown through the wind. Camille thought that the wind as a thread could pierce many people and thus connect them into some gigantic caterpillar. That is, into gigantic beads, where each individual person is a separate bead, and at the same time into a huge caterpillar, where each separate part of Putin's caterpillar so went out, or rather, the caterpillar walked along different streets, applied to the threads of the wind. One weekend, Camille had a snack before the show with Kafir and went for a walk with Jenna. She was going to stop by her place and take her out to the bar, or wherever she wanted to go. Camille thought that while Sebastian was away, maybe even move in with a friend for a few days, with Jenna taking time off work too. They would talk a lot, have a Bergman or Herman retrospective. Maybe she'll even help in the aggregate. If Wendy herself hasn't already thought of some new occupation and will pick up her first clients from the workers she knows at her firm. Foggy morning. Some kind of kefir, faded, not even kefir. Camille was beginning to recall the unpalatable soup with holes that she sometimes had to eat on weekends as a child. This soup had rare cooked vegetables in it, large chunks of dill stalks and greasy patches of oil on the surface. For some reason it always seemed cold, not even cold, but frozen like this. The fall weather had cooled off after summer. There were still large balls floating in the soup, and they came. But they didn't bring joy either. It was quiet and overcast. City mornings reminded Camille of this dull soup. All life was like this, dreary and ordinary, with greasy stains on the surface of the leftover and spilling broth everywhere in chunks, completely amorphous and falling apart, almost collapsing vegetables. Camille became so dreary that she decided to go into the small church next to which she passed through the windows of the building. A warm and pleasant light from the stylized electric candlelight was visible. There must have been a morning service, and Camille threw Jenna's leash a few times over the bars of a swing that stood not far from the door of the nursery and went into the building. And the rest of the service she caught a glimpse of, she liked. And as she left the building, Camille noticed that she was walking somehow even more leisurely and peaceful. Or maybe she's become less caught up in the world running somewhere and sees everything going on for a longer period of time and looks at the world more judiciously. Either way, Camille took her time tying up Jenna and occasionally glanced at those leaving the church. Sometimes she smiled at someone almost spontaneously and noticed in herself the emerging feeling of being in community with something and experiencing some common and pleasant secret that she had with these people. These thoughts pleased Camille, and she walked leisurely in front of the middle-aged women. "Good service," said one of them. "Yes, good, and the priest is so good, so right and inspiring leading. You can feel the grace," confirmed the other one. "Yeah, did you notice how good his laugh is? It's like nectar, and it's so honeyed." I recognized the first one. "Yeah, that's right. I just wanted to tell you when he was talking to the congregation after communion. What a delicious laugh." The second woman laughed after the words about laughter, as if she was prompted by the taste in her mouth. "What's a delicious one?" The first woman continued. "Yes, the particle is like jam. How delicious. A good service and a priest so good." The women turned down another street, and Camille no longer heard their conversation. She continued walking at a leisurely pace. The city was quiet in the morning. It was kind of nice inside. And when Camille felt like sneezing, she lifted her hand and pressed the edge of the top of her index finger deep into the corner between her lip and the bridge of her nose. She didn't want to break the silence with a loud check, but she didn't like it about herself either. And this method always helped quell the check. All it didn't take was a finger press right under her nose, and the sneeze would disappear as if it hadn't existed at all until now. Camille approached the house and mostly looked under her feet, digesting more of the experience from church, looking at the week and the yellow leaves on the asphalt sidewalk. She lifted her gaze higher, looked up at the Wendy and kitchen windows, next to which was a bulge from the typically compact balcony in the Khrushchevs. At first, she was even a little startled to see a half-naked man standing on the balcony. He was in one of his sleep robes, carelessly tied at the waist, but with a semi-open torso that looked not quite athletic, but overall quite harmonious and tanned. In the cool autumn air, Camille thought that the handsome bartender was standing on the balcony and slowed down to get a closer look at him. She was curious to find out more about her friend's new suitor. After all, people don't always reveal themselves in person, especially at first acquaintance. And here was still quite deserted morning. Putting on a robe, the man clearly enjoyed the opportunity to be almost on the street half naked and enjoy the proud solitude. Probably contemplating the accomplished and yet to come amorphous conquests on sleepy fronts, the man was clearly well prepared for his equestrian outing. Hedonist, Camille thought. Good in principle. After all, if he knows a thing or two about pleasure, he'll be able to provide Wendy with comfort and all sorts of pleasantries. He held on to the railing, smoky. Probably with a coffee mug next to it on the fracture was a lush morphine. Or some similar loaf in the other hand was a cigar, with which the man sometimes puffed on cigars. Camille stammered a little, for such a detail somehow filled out the image, but it also looked rather incongruous. The man stood with one foot on a low step, looking off into the distance and taking a big drag on a cigar. His whole appearance showed a successful businessman who had stepped out onto the upper terrace of his mansion and was contemplating the Hollywood Hills. Nevertheless, the outside space with this was clearly controlled by shabby Khrushchev buildings, a profusely broken and uneven street, slanting trees, silly banners, and advertisements. The man took his hand off the cup and took a bite of morphine with relish, never ceasing to hold the pose of shameful from. He sang from the cup and took a drag on his cigar. And in these movements, even rather in the sensations they expressed, tried to broadcast to the outside. Camille recognized something familiar. At first something like something known. Then she quickly guessed what familiar feelings this picture reminded her of. And such a cartoonish demeanor. Something akin to a howling fit of goosebumps went through her body. And then she barely restrained herself from laughing. So ridiculous she thought the figure was. And now, when she also realized the details, the situation seemed to her a complete delusion and some kind of mockery of the seriousness and normality of human life, played out before her by clowns in an unknown circus. What kind of idiot? Camille thought loudly to herself. She wanted to give Sebastian a resounding round of applause so that Sebastian would pay attention and shout something like adorable. Good girl. But she didn't want to spoil his moments of triumph and happiness. No matter how ridiculous and idiotic its Sebastian unhappiness did not seem to herself. A cigar on the balcony of a Khrushchevka. How ridiculous is that? But everyone wants happiness and strives for it. Camille thought, moving further down the street. She wasn't particularly worried about whether Sebastian would see her or not. The devil hasn't left me, Camille thought with a smile. Or is it time for new problems and worldly felons? Many people have such experiences, and everyone strives for happiness. Wendy listened to music from the cooler was in the croissants, sliced recently defrosted pastry. She hummed along to the vocals, singing along from her coffee mug and playfully swaying her hips to the beat, melodic in sound. Sebastian came into the narrow kitchen and sat in the chair where Camille usually sat. He motioned a saucer toward him and put down his cigar. Wendy had allowed him to smoke in the apartments so he could be comfortable. He watched her move in silence with a look of connoisseurship. It felt incredibly good and confident. We'll tell you. Wendy abruptly but gracefully straightened up after putting the tray of reds in the oven and turned to Sebastian. Will tell. Sebastian changed his tone questioningly, adding a bit of bewilderment. You don't think we should? What's the point for you to fight? For us to fight? For everyone to fight? There could be a lot of trouble afterward. Property. Yeah, property. There's all sorts of problems. And I don't want it. You still want to be with me. Wendy put her feet on the inside of Daddy's thigh and leaned her body toward him, bringing her face close with a playful smile and a burning gaze. With you. Yes, Sebastian tried to look serious and judicious, but his voice still trembled a little. It was obvious that he was getting excited and yet enjoying the attention from Wendy. We don't need to tell you. We can do that, can't we? I guess we can. Not much difference to me. And anyway, if you look at it that way, it's good that my friend and I share the same hobbies and tastes. Right? Maybe someday you can talk to her and we can work things out. I'm not claiming anything. You know, I'm not one for the details of everyday life and family life. But if we're good with each other and bring each other joy, why not? Sebastian kissed Wendy's exposed thigh and took a sip from his cup. She sat down on his leg, and they both stared out the warm window of the oven where the good stuff was written down. Wendy put one arm around him. They were quiet and realized they didn't feel like talking. The steady whirring of the stove was nodding and soothing. The overcast weather did little to us. They smiled occasionally, glancing at each other. The bread made them howl from their cups. Wendy, for a laugh, could smell his cigar and make a funny and important grimace. She even remembered some of the facial expressions Camille had entertained her with recently, with an ethereal mustache, and showed Sebastian. He smiled and put his arm around her waist, emphasizing her slightly so she could get comfortable on him. The measured time stretched on, and they seemed to be frozen in some kind of timelessness and serenity. That must be what happy moments looked like. Sebastian somehow no longer felt the tension that was often present in his mind about having to prove something, to show something, unbeknownst to him, to the audience. Now, even though he was aware that he was someone who was behaving immorally, he somehow felt himself acting. Rightly, he felt that it was the right thing to do. That it was good he had thought of it, and good that he and Wendy were spending their time this way. He felt that now the audience could praise him, and he himself could tell, when the opportunity arose and the right situation arose, about his adventures with other normal men, as if in between, as if to say that he had once bitten off a sweet bite of this life. Literally, a little bit literally, hints on gentlemanly will describe some of the most attractive details of sleepy appearance. And then they'll talk about something else, but his buddies will appreciate it, and maybe will throw in support, and even with a little envy, but also with the understanding that here he is, Sebastian, a normal guy, came from the province and achieved everything, made a career, is successful with girls, has a family, always cool and confident looks. For some reason, Sebastian thought that now more accurately in such a situation, if someone will reflect on his success, he can become an example for someone to be an example, and therefore it is necessary to prove and conform. One should behave perfectly, to be clear in everything from day-to-day affairs, bringing large-scale work projects. Sebastian drank moments of joy from a mug, kissed them on the surface of sunny cheeks, sighed with Serbian smoke, peered through the window of the oven. And Camille took to the street and rustled the yellow foliage. She thought about the fact that leaves of golden and yellow color are like coins that trees have accumulated. It is their treasure and valuables that they can show off and make so beautiful, colorful crowns, attract the eye, creates a wonderful pattern that delights. And the trees themselves also know that they have accumulated much treasure and are now beautiful. Suddenly, they realize that this time will end and winter is coming, which will mercilessly freeze them. The trees understand and are worried. They want to pay off the winter and scatter yellow coins, leaves. They try to bribe and give away their wealth to the world. They no longer think of their own beauty and attractiveness. The trees only think about what to give away so that they can continue to stand so that they don't freeze. These bribes, however, cannot bribe the annual move. Winter takes no bribes, and fall continues to overstay its welcome with winds, announcing cold blizzards. Leaves flew in front of found feet. Nola would sometimes rush to play with them and bite some, or only whisk her head into another lifted cloud of leaves, waving her ears and sputtering.
Subscribe and click the bell.
An early call on a Sunday morning can drive anyone crazy, and instantly. As much as Susan was always ready to help, she jumped up from her bachelor couch in a frenzy. She threw on a brightly colored silk robe that was about to slip off her shoulders and rushed to the door to pour all her indignation on the caller. Whoever the early visitor was, now he would get the full measure of it. But the girl had to not only hide her anger, but also to worry about the newcomer. In the hallway stood her best friend and part-time neighbor Helen. When Susan saw her face in the door peephole, she began to twist the lock with shaking hands, but as always in such cases, it did not open for some reason. Finally, Susan swung the door open and almost screamed in Helen's face. "What's wrong?" "Thomas isn't well." Helen looked at her friend in surprise. "He's fine. What are you doing?" Susan exhaled and invited her in. "Come in, since you haven't slept since 7 o'clock in the morning." Her friend's behavior was not quite usual. Usually she fell on the sofa near the table and waited for Susan to serve tea or make coffee. But Helen never stopped chatting, looking in the refrigerator for goodies and asking Susan questions. In short, she behaved as if she were at home. And today even her steps were slow, giving away the girl's embarrassment. "How are you?" she asked, not boldly, finally, after some fumbling on the sofa. "What do you mean, how?" Susan's eyes widened. "I was asleep, and you got up at the crack of dawn." Considering the fact that only a few hours had passed together, it was a very strange question, without substance, as their former higher math teacher would say. Looking at her friend carefully, Susan realized that the matter was not clear and asked, "Why did you come here?" "Susan." Helen looked at her with the most honest blue eyes she had ever seen. "Susan, let me go to the sea." Susan looked into that purity and blue and was silent. "Why do you look at me like that?" "I've been taking ducks out for 3 years. Thomas this, Thomas that. I'm sick of it. I want to take a vacation, and Matthew has already bought the tickets, booked the hotel. I'm expecting such romance, mountains, sea, buffet, and you're ruining my mood with your sour face." "Helen, how can you not be ashamed? He's your husband." Susan was kind, but honest and fair. Her friend's cheating while her husband was alive was not just unpleasant, but disgusting. These conversations between friends had been going on for a long time, and Helen had reacted to them just as she did now. "So what? I'm a human being too, and I need positive emotions, otherwise I'll languish. I'm already completely feral. I've turned into an old woman. People go everywhere, go to the sea, have a vacation, but me." Helen almost cried. She felt sorry for herself. "Well, Susan, you won't refuse me, will you?" "I still don't understand how it's possible. Thomas is not stupid. He understands everything. He'll know you've gone off with your lover. I don't care. Maybe then he'll realize what I'm sacrificing." "Helen, you're playing with fire. Have you forgotten who makes your money? Even now that Thomas is in a wheelchair, you're on his payroll. You haven't forgotten that his bright head gives you everything. And you don't work, and you still don't work. Why do you reproach me with a piece of bread?" "Of course I don't work. I'm probably married, taking care of him. He must be an invalid. He needs a nurse. Helen's mood changed 100 times in half an hour. Oh, Helen! She always knew how to defend herself, and now she squinted her eyes and smiled predatorily. Are you in love with my invalid husband? You're worried about him, confess. Susan, suddenly blushing, shook her head negatively. You're such a pest. Helen had no intention of backing down. Well, if you don't want to, then don't. I'll find out. Obviously, there are some services. Can't I find a nurse in a big city for 10 days? And she walked proudly out the door with her snub nose. She made Susan so angry with her snide question that she said angrily, There's no need to call anywhere. I'll look after Thomas. Helen smiled immediately, as if she had expected nothing else. That's good. Here are your keys. I'm leaving early tomorrow morning. You can figure it out on your own. Wow! It just popped into Susan's head. She took the spare keys with her. She was sure that I would help her deceive her husband. As Susan saw her friend off, Susan almost regretted her sudden decision. Helen was gone as quickly as she had appeared. It was for her impetuosity and determination that Thomas had fallen in love with her 5 years ago, choosing one of her 2 girlfriends. Helen and Susan had always been close, but modest Susan had never been noisy, not particularly witty, and Helen's determination was far from her. The reason they were friends was probably because opposites attract. Helen, with her violent temperament, sometimes had to be restrained. Only Susan could do it. Even Helen's mom would ask her, Susan, do your best to talk her out of that pimplay Ethan. He'll cheat and dump her, and we'll have to deal with her tantrums. And indeed, it turned out that Ethan, whom Helen was crazy about, had a family and 2 children. Susan was able to prove it to her friend, who was already dreaming of getting married to a handsome man who was having affairs with everyone. Helen, in turn, was also not a dependent Susan kindness. She helped her with housing. When she became friends with a foreign modest girl in her first year, invited her to her place. Susan lived in the dormitory during her sophomore year, but their friendship was so strong that now Helen could stay in her room overnight, especially on those evenings when there were dances nearby. The friends shared their joys and sorrows, but they were not lucky enough to fall in love. They fell in love with the same guy. Thomas studied at a prestigious specialty in their institute, 2 courses older. He was enthusiastic about his future profession, and he was prophesied a brilliant future. The slender, handsome man was a dream of any girl, but he was not attracted to them at all. He was always busy with business. It can be said that Helen herself took the initiative, and he first succumbed to the charm of blue-eyed, cheerful girl, and then fell in love with her. Helen and Thomas were married rather quickly. Helen's family organized a wedding fun, rich, for fellow students. It was a real holiday, including a feast of the belly, which is important for the poor, knowing the granite of science. The party was long and lavish, and who could escort the bride down the aisle? Susan, of course, was a witness at the wedding. The girl tried to smile and pretend that she was having fun, although the cats were scratching at her soul. She tried not to look in the direction of the groom all evening. As soon as she noticed that he was showing interest in Helen, Susan immediately stepped aside. How could anyone get in the way of the maid of honor? Susan, of course, continued to communicate with Helen all the following years. They are friends, but at their home tried not to be at their home. It must be said that she was lucky to have a place to live. In a small hut on the outskirts lived her distant relative, who was either a 3rd or 4th cousin of her grandmother. Susan, out of the kindness of her heart, began to visit the old woman at the request of her relatives. She had never seen Kathy before, but they became friends. Very soon, the positive and hardworking girl became the right hand of the old woman who had long been difficult to leave the house. Kathy was not very ill and died in her sleep. After burying her relative, Susan found out that she had become the owner of her house, and her friends, the newly married couple, had just bought a house nearby. However, it was almost an exchange, as Thomas had an apartment in another neighborhood from his parents. Susan visited them only when she knew for sure that her friend's husband was absent. It was very hard to see Thomas looking at Helen with loving eyes. In 5 years, Susan had never met someone who could displace Thomas from her heart, so she had lived close to the man who occupied her thoughts. But now it was as if he didn't exist for Susan. A stranger's husband, a friend's husband, and just under 3 years ago, a neighbor's family had had an accident. "Thomas, are you sure you're not going to Mary's birthday party?" "No, Helen," I explained. "We're delivering a program to a client. We're past the deadline, and the guys are having some problems, and they're asking for help." I promised. "How can I get a ride?" "You alone have fun without me, Mary. By the way, congratulate me, and also ask me to apologize on my behalf." With these words, Thomas kissed his wife and went out. The day was a weekday and work was not waiting. Helen sighed, stretched in her cozy bed, and fell asleep again. She woke up when the sun was already high. After eating breakfast, she quietly began to brush her feathers. She took a shower and spent a long time primping herself in the mirror. Then she carefully worked on her evening dress. She took one dress out of the closet and another out of the closet. To one of the shoes were uncomfortable. The second will look gloomy in an evening cafe, but this one, soft turquoise, very much suited her. And not too bright, will not overshadow the outfit of the birthday girl, and favorably emphasizes the eyes. "Good, so good," wrote Helen, throwing on a dress with a hanger and dancing in front of the mirror. Since celebrating the wedding with Thomas, Helen lived easily and carefree, having sold the apartment of Thomas's parents, quickly bought a new, bigger, cozier. And most of its cost was paid by themselves, but as themselves, Helen, of course, did not work. Why should she? If her husband earned so well. Helen told her friends and opened her blue eyes wide. "We didn't even notice how we paid off the mortgage. Everything, thank God, is enough. I chose the furniture for the new apartment myself, carefully according to my taste, so that everything fit together." Going to the store gave Helen incomparable pleasure, and she gradually became almost an expert in the world of shopping. Slowly the girl began to deal with herself, visited the pool, spa procedures, and the fact that she had a permanent makeup artist, hairdresser, and manicurist, and nothing to say. No, she did not become pampered and proud boorish, but modest service to her person, began to afford. It pleased her. "Why did you study then?" friends asked. 5 years at a prestigious faculty, and now the diploma is lying somewhere. Why did you have to work so hard? "Well, hello," Helen marveled. "First of all, the diploma does not interfere with me a bit. Higher education is a prestigious thing after all. You know, people have a different attitude when you tell them the name of your university. What to do all day long if you don't have to work? My friends didn't calm down. No children. Well, children are a living thing." Helen waved them away. "It will always be in time, while we with Thomas do not want to deprive themselves of freedom." "And what do you mean? What to do?" "And the apartment. You have to fix it up, take care of yourself. You know, I feel sorry for my husband. You come with him somewhere to a banquet, for example, or on the anniversary of his leadership, and he has a shaggy wife with rough heels and burrs on the nails. I'll embarrass him. And he's not a laborer, he's the head of the department, by the way. So it should be his look, not yours. arguing interlocutors. Yes, of course. Helen laughed. The king makes the entourage. Have you heard such wisdom, girls? And the husband makes successful who? The wife. That's me. I'm the reason Thomas rose. However, soon Helen's friends became quite different. Just like herself, spa and shopping enthusiasts. Those former ones had to earn money. They had no time to listen to the petty troubles of a well-off lady. Helen didn't care about them at all. She spun in a whirlwind of previously unavailable pleasures. No, of course, her parents had provided her with the best of everything before. An only daughter, how could they spoil her? But there was no waiting around, no begging. Thomas entrusted her with all the family bookkeeping and did not interfere in economic affairs, and Helen, with her irrepressible energy, just what she needed. She didn't spend, didn't squander her husband's money, no. There were calculations, but for herself first and foremost. Today on Mary's birthday, their common old acquaintances gathered, and subconsciously, Helen wanted to surprise everyone, to look the best, to have fun, to prove to who knows who that she lived a wonderful full life. Preparing for this event took some creative effort on her part. Finally, she was ready, and that's when the phone rang. Hello. Yes, I paged you. I'm on my way out. And Helen, humming a cheerful song under her nose, ran out of the apartment to the entrance where a cab was waiting for her. Thomas came home from work late at night. Helen was still out. The house seemed empty without her. He dialed his wife's cell phone number. Honey, how are you? Did you have a good time? Oh, Thomas, I'm so glad you're free. It's been a long holiday. It's been a lot of fun, but I'm tired. If you come with me, it will be wonderful. Thomas laughed. There she was, his wife, having fun and tired. How he loved her childlike spontaneity and inconsistency. All right, I'll be right there, he answered. Then we'll have tea together. The restaurant was noisy, smoky, and somehow not festive. Entering the room, Thomas involuntarily wrinkled his nose. He had never liked eating establishments, and he considered restaurants, if not a breeding ground for vice, then certainly a haven for idlers. Handsome, come to us. A well-drunk girl with smeared eyes clung to him. She grabbed him by the elbow and began to pull him towards her laughing friends of the same obscene appearance. Another time. Carefully but firmly withdrawing her arm, Thomas said. He found Helen at the bar, where most of Mary's guests, the staunchest ones, were already seated. The rest of them were too drunk to try to do anything on their own. Only a few more sober couples were stomping around in the middle of the room, dancing to the soft music of a small orchestra, and the orchestra, consisting of an accordionist, a trumpeter, a couple of guitarists, and a drummer, and the dancing couples, and even the bartender of the bar, though torn by customers, seemed to be tired and trying to portray life from the last effort. Helen decided to have a coffee, feeling that she needed to chase away the hops a little, but the decision was risky, and she had been fending off inebriated company for a long time. Her husband showed up just in time. It had to be said. Thomas. Helen shouted excitedly when she saw him from afar. There's my husband. This was meant for the drunken blonde, who tried to drag her to the dance, trying to combine clumsily drunken gallantry with brute physical force. Husband full of peers, yelled one of the blonde's friends. No, this is not our husband. We do not want such a husband. Come on, honey, I'll show you the sky and diamonds. Mumbled in the meantime, barely standing on his feet, the hapless suitor, and dragged Helen by the arm, not worrying about hurting her. Come on, boss. Get her out. Sheared on by the jackals surrounding the blonde. We're going out tonight. Take the girl. Let her go. Softly, said Thomas, coming close to the blond man. He looked at Thomas, unable to realize what they wanted from him, and stubbornly continued to pull the girl by the arm away from the bar. "What are you doing, kid?" A more sober-looking man, a forehead of absolutely criminal appearance, with tattoos on his fingers, moved at Thomas. "You got your paw on the boss." He made an imperceptible movement, and Thomas lost his balance. He struggled to stay on his feet and retaliated, but immediately the other cronies took the fight in a ring. Hands, heads, and bodies flashed in the smoke, and a woman's shrieks and screams were heard. A multi-armed, dense tangle of men's bodies appeared next to the bar. Helen couldn't see, but she knew that Thomas was somewhere down there, under that pile, and she called out to him. "Thomas, Thomas!" The guard blew his whistle, and in an instant the whole gang disappeared from the hall. Only Thomas was still lying on the floor, bleeding underneath. "Thomas, open your eyes, Thomas!" shouted Helen, leaning over her husband. Her friends tried to calm her down. "I'll go with you, Helen," said Mary, who in a way considered herself guilty of what had happened. It was her party that had ended so unhappily. When the ambulance arrived, she helped Helen onto the stretcher on which Thomas had been placed. Helen had no idea what was happening, and when the bloodless Thomas was loaded onto the gurney and wheeled into the operating room, she sat almost unconsciously on a table in the white hallway and closed her eyes as if she wanted to hide from reality. The surgery went on for a long time. The surgeon came out to the exhausted Helen. "As long as he sleeps, life is out of danger," but the drunken bully's knife had damaged her vertebrae. The doctor hid his eyes. "When can I pick him up?" Helen asked, not realizing the danger of the situation. "Not soon, I'm afraid." The doctor began to wipe the glasses unnecessarily. "For a long time he needs absolute peace. And what?" Helen impatiently fixed her eyes on the doctor's frowning face. "Your husband won't be able to walk yet." "What do you mean he can't walk?" Helen smiled confusedly. "He won't be able to walk, but what about it? It's good that the blow didn't hit his vital organs, but then you should be thankful that he's alive. Get him on disability. He can probably work from home. He's an engineer, you said. How's the disability?" Helen was just heartbroken. "Maybe someday, but for now, your husband needs your help. Your care and kindness will help him recover, of course, but a full life is out of the question." Helen felt as if she had been replaced, and she went to doctors and institutes, but in vain. Susan, when she heard about the accident, came running to her old friend, and now she was always near her. She empathized with her so much, helped to prepare Helen's apartment, everything for Thomas's discharge, advised her how to arrange the house so that both of them would be more comfortable. She helped in word and deed. It made her heart bleed to think of Thomas. A beautiful and clever young man, now he would be trapped inside the walls of the apartment. And what kind of ordeal would he endure in the hospital room and the operating room? Susan could think of no one else. Her heart still belonged to him alone. She watched Helen's efforts to help her husband regain his health with envy, but also with joy. May he be happy at least in what Helen could do. Thought Susan, and one day said, "Helen, I didn't even realize you had such a heart. What a good girl you are. All that worry means you love Thomas very much. What are you talking about? What the hell kind of heart? Don't you realize I have to live with an invalid, a half-man? I don't want to. Well, I realize I can't leave him. Everyone, you'll think I'm bad, and I'll have to waste my life on it." Helen burst into tears. Susan was shocked by her words, and especially her tone. "How can you say that? Thomas has suffered because of you. Who asked him to? If he's not a man and he can't fight, Why the hell did he get involved? He's caused me the kind of trouble you wouldn't wish on anyone. Divided Helen was no longer crying, but frantically planning her next trip to the medical luminary who could help her get the invalid, as she called her husband, back on his feet. Susan was simply amazed at how bluntly and cynically her friend explained her troubles. "You are only selfish." She was indignant as she watched her friend blowing the curls that had fallen from her forehead away from her face with an angry expression, and Helen looked particularly pretty. "I'd look at you if you had such a thing. How selfish would you be?" In Helen's beautiful eyes, there were angry tears. She wailed for a long time about her plight, but Susan tried not to listen to her. There were many things about her friend that had often caused Susan rejection and even dislike, but now she couldn't accept what Helen was saying. Full of sympathy for Thomas, who was not even aware of the treacherous soul of his wife, Susan even dared to visit him in the hospital a few times, but Thomas was embarrassed. Susan herself did not know how to behave. Knowing Helen's attitude towards her husband, she could not pretend that all was well. It would look silly to cheer her up. Thomas is a sober-minded man, a strong man. He doesn't need these appealing slogans. The embarrassed Susan sat there for 5 minutes, and then she hurried out of the room. And then her friend struck her in the heart. It seemed impossible to betray someone once betrayed, but Helen managed. Helen had dropped by Susan's room a couple of times, cheerful, smelling of perfume, her eyes shining as they had in her early youth. Oh, how Susan remembered that look on her friend's face. Excitement, incredible energy and activity, all these were signs that the girl had fallen in love. And as Susan realized, her old friend was not crazy about her own husband. "Spit it out, Helen," she said sternly when her friend dropped by the other day to borrow a flat iron. "Mine's burnt out, and I'm walking around like an ugly woman." She explained to Susan, "I'm going to keep it until I buy a new one." "You don't care. You don't curl." Well, Helen was the one who cared about her appearance. She pretended not to take Susan's hint. "What do you mean, like get a curl? What are you talking about, girlfriend?" But she was stretching her mouth from the scarlet lipstick in a wide smile. "You're not messing with my head." Susan wouldn't give up. "I can see you at 100 meters. Who you got yourself, you hussy?" "What do you mean, a slut?" Helen also resented me. "You know I would never." "Never her." Susan laughed in her face. "And you cheated just once?" "Yes, I'm in love, Susan." And Helen cried. Susan had to listen to a story that Helen thought would exonerate her. The poor girl, alone, forgotten, neglected by everyone, and only her invalid husband with her, day and night, demanding troubles and cares, incredible efforts on the part of the faithful wife. And here he is, loving, tender, affectionate, intelligent, understanding everything, in short, the epithets that a true man should have. He's like that, you know, Susan. And Helen was silent, covering her eyes, unable to describe adequately all the wonderful qualities of Matthew's character. That was the name of her lover. "I remember you said the same thing about Thomas." Susan didn't soften at all. "I had quickly forgotten what he was like, and he still is, so how could he be worse? He's the same Thomas, aren't you?" "Yeah, of course he is. He's the same, but not the same. I lived behind him like a stone wall. He did everything for me, and now, how can you understand?" And Helen gave her friend an almost contemptuous look. "You've been alone all your life. At least have a lover or something? Otherwise you're sitting there all infallible." Susan looked at her friend in silence, and she couldn't stand her gaze. "What are you looking at? What did I say wrong? Only the plain truth, right?" "Well, Helen, I'll tell you the plain truth too, you bastard. Not only are you selfish, but you're a traitor." Friends quarreled for a long time. Yesterday, after a chance meeting, they seemed to make up, had coffee, but still unexpected was the morning Helen came to Susan. Helen acted as if nothing had happened, but Susan? She was used to all the twists and turns of life, and she was always ready to open the door to anyone who called at it. Susan had not slept much during the night. Her friend's request had stirred her soul. She tossed and turned in her comfortable bed, opened the windows and drank water. When it became clear that she couldn't doze off that easily, she threw a blanket over her shoulders and stepped out onto the balcony into the coolness. The town was sleeping peacefully, only somewhere far away, in the neighborhood of detached small houses, where the new building had not reached, barked something alarmed dogs. "Why are you barking?" Susan asked them. "People are asleep, and you're barking, and you're asleep." She was always talking to something when no one could hear her, to a teacup that slipped out of her hands, to a tree that caught a branch in her hair, to a stray cat that came into her path and looked with a green gaze straight into her eyes, demanding food. Helen's knowledge of this habit of hers would have twisted a finger at her temple. Blessed are you, Susan. But Susan, some of her thoughts and feelings were hidden deep inside. It was enough that the people around her knew that she was not a stupid girl, though she did not have enough stars from the sky. She is not grasping in life, but she knows how to climb all the way and tear off a piece of herself, that she is strict, if not to say harsh. She doesn't tolerate men around her. Maybe she's been through enough. No one knew. Since childhood, only Helen knew her, but that one did not bother to think about the character of her friend and could not tell anyone anything special about her. Even if it was necessary that she was blessed, she would confirm it. Such a modest woman that it's sickening but Helen was always scolding her for it. If only her friend knew what it was like for Susan not to show her feelings for Thomas. How she could use that proverbial modesty to cover her love, her refusal to communicate with him. She even stopped going to discos with Helen, realizing that she would be with Thomas. And how can you take away the excitement when you see his fluffy, like a girl's eyelashes over his brown eyes? How do you hold back the disappointed exhale when he's hugging someone else in front of you? So what if it's your best friend? The more it hurts. It must be said that at first Susan, with all her body and soul, rushed towards the young man. She flew to wherever he was. She talked about him. She was burning with love. It seemed that he was also drawn to Susan, but one evening, sitting with Helen on a bench near the entrance, Susan suddenly heard, "Susan, I'm in love." Her friend even seemed a little embarrassed. "That's not like Helen." "Again?" Susan laughed. "This is the 5th time this year." "You're laughing, and I haven't slept for 2 nights." Helen roared. "I've never had anything like this in my life, you know that." She continued to sob. She wondered who is this scoundrel who tortures her favorite girl. "Don't cry, silly." She stroked Helen's back. "You should be happy. It's great to fall in love for real, and even in spring." "You think so?" Helen exhaled into her friend's chest and looked at her with blue eyes full of tears. She was just like the doll from the picture, but her feelings were really strong. "Do you think Thomas will love me too?" "He doesn't pay any attention to me. He's dancing with you or whispering with Clara from the 5th group, and I'm suffering." Helen continued to describe her suffering, but Susan could no longer hear her. After Thomas's name was called, it was as if she had been hit on the head with something terribly heavy and dull. And from that moment, she sank into utter despair, and that was it. She stopped flying. Her heart was smoldering in her breast, burning slowly from a great feeling that was carefully concealed, and it was impossible to let this fire burn, lest it should burn the 3 of them at once. Toward morning, Susan fell into a heavy sleep and awoke unaccustomedly late, at 11:30. The sun was beating through the bedroom window and had already warmed the linoleum on the floor beside the bed. My head ached, and with a heavy heart I began to pack, and everything was going wrong. She lost her hairbrush, the hair dryer wouldn't turn on, the coffee came out of the turbo and flooded the stove. She wondered how she would explain Helen's departure to Thomas. Would they be able to tell a decent lie? The whole story disgusted her, and Susan felt like she was about to jump into the unknown. The cliff did not seem quiet and peaceful. Finally, the shower was over. Her head was in order. The rest of the spilled coffee was drunk. There was nowhere to go. It was time to go, no matter how much she procrastinated. Susan grabbed her purse and left the apartment. The morning had not yet fully turned into day. The weather was fine. While she got to the house of her friends, where she decided to walk, the girl calmed down a little and tuned it to the right wave. Be that as it may. After all, there was no fault of hers, and to decide for others their fate, it is not given to her. By the time she got there, it was about 12. She found the keys in her purse quickly, opened the door, hesitantly entered. Still, even though she'd been setting herself up all night and all morning, Susan was having a hard time. Now she would see Thomas. It had been many months since her unfortunate visit to the hospital, and the woman was worried. With a pounding heart, she walked to the deserted kitchen, took a carton of milk out of her bag, and put it in the refrigerator. Only after washing her hands, running a damp hand across her forehead, did she finally decide to walk to the room where Thomas was supposed to be. She was also helping Helen get her ready. Knocking lightly, she opened the door ajar. "May I?" Thomas, dressed in a white t-shirt and sports pants, was sitting in a chair by the computer desk. The man didn't immediately realize that it wasn't his wife walking around the apartment, and was very surprised when he heard a knock on the door and then saw Susan enter. "Susan? What are you doing here? How did you get in?" Susan silently showed his keys. "I don't understand. Where's Helen? Did something happen? She had to leave on business." Thomas's face twisted, and he gritted his teeth. She'd gone to the sea with Matthew, after all. Susan saw Thomas's hand on the table, clenched into a fist, and the jowls on his face flared. She could see that he was sharply upset and trying to contain his anger. But what struck her most was that he wasn't surprised that he'd known before. "Where did you?" The question froze on her lips. "How do I know?" Thomas grinned unkindly. "Well, lately, Helen hasn't been very shy with me. She treated me like a piece of furniture. Could talk quietly on the phone at 2 o'clock as if I were handicapped and on my ears. Susan didn't know how to soothe or comfort him, said the first thing that came to mind. "Thomas, Helen is just tired." And then she realized how stupid that sounded, and Thomas grinned evilly. "Tired? Tired of what? I do the cooking. I do the laundry too. I even learned how to use the vacuum cleaner. But I can't go to the store, and I can't take out the garbage, and you've come to cover for your girlfriend? Well, I can tell you that you shouldn't. I'm doing just fine on my own." He turned his baby carriage around and headed for the other room, and Susan was struck by his every word. She had thought she would find an invalid lying there, a helpless sick man who needed care every minute of the day. Yes, of course, Thomas, the Thomas she knew and loved, was going to be like that, independent and strong and angry. The astonished Susan fully accepted his anger and resentment toward his wife. She probably should have left, but for some reason she was angry too and followed him. Thomas was looking out the large window facing the street. You could see by the look on his face that he was a little overcome with emotion. I understand you, Thomas, Susan said softly, but I had nothing to do with it. I didn't know, I promise you. Thomas did not look her in the face. He felt ashamed that he had attacked Susan. She had never given any reason to suspect her of the slightest deceit or intrigue. She was, in Thomas's mind, one of the finest girls he'd ever met. I'm sorry. Muffled, he said. I must have misspoken. I didn't mean to offend you, did I? Well then, why don't we at least have some tea? I've been walking so long, it's already hot outside. Come on. The man changed his tone abruptly. You do the kitchen, and I'll finish my work quickly. I've got a little bit to do, and then I'm free. While Susan made tea and sliced a cake, for which she had specially visited her favorite pastry shop, Thomas was able to finish the work scheduled for today. Rubbing his hands together in anticipation of the tea party, he rolled into the kitchen and washed his hands under the faucet for a long time. I'm a sick man. I can wash here too. I just need to write places for children and the handicapped. His black humor did not seem so black because surprisingly the man's mood rose, and at the table he was having fun, as if he had forgotten about his wife and her treacherous departure. So you work from home? Susan asked, though she had heard about it from her conversations with Helen. Susan, you know that work is more important to me than anything else. Thomas answered and looked her in the eyes for the first time. Susan knew. She saw that familiar look and remembered how from their first meeting she had remembered those brown eyes, the deep, penetrating gaze of Thomas, with which he seemed to encompass not the outer, but the inner essence of a person. How then did it happen that their life together with Helen turned out so unsuccessfully? Or was it all to blame, the fateful incident in that very restaurant be damned? She involuntarily averted her eyes so as not to betray her feelings and asked, "And how do you get the assignment, and how do you manage to work with the group? After all, your guys probably continue to work as before. There are no problems." Thomas answered with a noticeably more cheerful tone. "We used to talk on the internet a lot if we had to make a decision. The machine, as he called the computer, stayed on 24 o'clock. That's what you do. I remember one night I dreamed of an important move, jumped up to the computer, and even Skype had to be used to wake Jack up. The two of us were working it out, his wife yelling at me for not letting us sleep, Helen yelling at me. Then Thomas goes quiet, and Helen comes to mind. Susan had to invent a simpler topic to distract him from his sad thoughts. Do you ever go outside? You're like Schumacher in your wheelchair, aren't you? No, I'm mostly on the balcony. Thomas shrugged it off. Why not? The weather's so nice out. A street is a street, and there are neighbors, and all sorts of animals and birds. Susan was puzzled. There's a staircase on the first floor that I can't climb by myself. I don't want to ask anyone. What about Helen? She's at home. Well, Helen, she's always busy. She says you can get some air on the balcony. It's nothing. I'm often on the balcony, especially in the evening. Susan, to be honest, didn't understand. Helen had always told her that she was almost carrying pots for her husband, but it turned out to be the other way around. She knew her friend's habit of justifying herself, no matter what the circumstances, but to make up such a brazen composition, to elevate herself to the rank of Sister of Mercy, it's too much. While Susan was digesting the information she had received, Thomas had quite deftly dragged the dishes to the sink and had already begun to name them. Susan took a dish towel and began to wipe the cups, standing next to him. How about after tea we go for some air? A walk in the park? He looked at her in surprise and happily agreed. They were having fun. Thomas was joking with himself. I'm the beneficiary today. I have to look good. He pulled one t-shirt after another out of the closet, then looked at Susan and discarded it. No, that won't do. We have to have the same color scheme. Why is that? Susan wondered, amused by the man's grip on the pile of clothes. Why not? Let everyone see that we are together. There must be an ensemble in everything, even in clothes. The blood rushed to Susan's cheeks. Silly, innocent jokes, but she was still relieved and pleased that he had at least united in this way. Opening all the windows wide open to air out the apartment in their absence, they moved into the hallway. The elevator, then the proverbial stairs, which, with Susan's help, they overcame almost imperceptibly. And now they were in the park. Fresh wind, bright greenery, birds chirping. Thomas had a look of bliss on his face. He easily rolled his stroller along the sidewalk, and Susan walked beside him and did not even notice that he was not walking beside her, but sitting. She had no thoughts that he was an inferior, defective man. What kind of a handicapped man is he? He is the smartest, the most beautiful, and the best. Susan settles down on the bench. Thomas stops his stroller across the street so he can see her face. "Oh my God, Susan," he said, covering his eyes. "You just made me so happy. Do you realize that?" He looked at her again with that penetrating gaze of his. "It's the first time I've been this happy in years. Do you know what it's like to walk outside? I don't care if it's in a stroller. It's happiness to sit in the sun, and if it was raining, I'd be happy in the rain, and if it was windy, you'd be wet in the rain and cold in the wind." Susan laughed, not letting him finish. Now she didn't remember how worried she had been before she came. All thoughts of what and how she would explain it had crashed into Thomas's simplicity. She was at ease with him, as if there were no years that had passed, her anguish about him being someone else's husband, and she had finally made up her mind. "Thomas, I probably shouldn't ask that question. Helen is my friend, but I don't understand what's holding you back. You're so independent, aren't you?" "Yeah, I feel sorry for her. She's not used to work. She's not used to life. But she's adapted." He grinned again, bitterness showing through his smile. "Now I don't even know what to do." "But you love her, don't you?" I used to." Thomas grunted, embarrassed, and turned the conversation to something else. There was an inner tact that her friend Helen lacked, thought Susan, looking at Thomas's smiling lips and changing face. She laughed at his jokes, said something to him, while she herself didn't quite understand even the topic of the conversation. She was simply enjoying these precious hours of conversation with the one who from the first day of their acquaintance had been the only one to occupy her thoughts and feelings, but the evening chill was beginning to be felt. "What's up, Goose?" Susan addressed Thomas affectionately. "For a first walk, I think that's quite enough, don't you?" "I would have stayed here, Susan," he confessed, "but I'm afraid you're too strict. You'll punish me for breaking the regime." "How would I punish you?" Susan laughed. "Not serving dinner? So you're the one with the mustache." Again with jokes and laughter, we started on the way back. A light dinner seemed enough for both of them. Thomas was tired from the fresh air. Susan, who had been sleep-deprived and worried all this time, had not taken care of anything substantial. Helen had eggs and butter in the refrigerator, thank God, so we ate what normal people usually eat for breakfast, omelettes. Now that we've eaten, we can go to sleep. Susan laughed, mimicking Mama Toad from the cartoon. The dishes were put away again, and then Susan, despite Thomas's objections, quickly hung up his scattered clothes in the closet and said goodbye. "Well, I'm off. What can I buy for tomorrow?" "Yes, I'm not fussy. 1 potato or pasta is enough for me," answered the embarrassed Thomas. He was uncomfortable, a grown man, but he was sitting and waiting for a stranger, a beautiful woman even more so, to bring him groceries. All right, then it's up to me, okay? Susan smiled. I'll come over right after work. Okay, good night. Good night, Susan. Thomas replied affectionately. Thank you, you know. He looked away embarrassed. As Susan walked home, she had so many thoughts on her mind. Why hadn't Helen left at least the basic necessities? Why hadn't she even thought to give money or warn her that there was nothing in the house to cook with? Why? But she shoved all these economic endeavors away from her and began to sing quietly to herself a long-standing song. Couldn't she just be happy that she was alive and well? That she spent almost the whole day with the man she loved. Even if he was a stranger's husband, Susan had not trespassed on him in any way, but they had had that day, well, even if it was only half a day, but what joyful hours it had been. She looked at Thomas, admired him, listened to his voice. Susan walked on and could not feel her feet, immersed in the depths of her own happiness. She was sure she would not sleep again for a long time tonight. But as soon as she was in her bed, she fell into a happy, serene sleep. It was not surprising that Thomas had not slept that night. He had a lot to think about. Why did his and Helen's life have to be like this? After a day spent outdoors with Susan, the man felt like the past was just a dream. He seemed to have a second wind today. Everything was refracted now through these half-days. Peaceful, full sun and sky, hours, time that was adorned with good, not burdensome conversation, bird chirping. In fact, today he was finally breathing fully for the first time since that fight in the restaurant. For the first time, he was truly enjoying life. Why aren't you happy? Helen used to pick on him. But why? Why aren't you rejoicing loudly? I am rejoicing loudly. It's just you listening quietly. Thomas laughed and admired his beloved, beautiful wife. She opened her blue eyes wide and began to tease him again. You, Thomas, are just a babaca. And she would laugh. Everything seemed funny to her then. Jokes, fun, the constant companions of youth, and they both had the same habits. They liked the same songs, movies, were friends with classmates. Common friends, just as noisy and mischievous, often gathered at their homes, singing songs to the guitar, dancing. There were times when one of the guys, Thomas's associates, in the midst of the fun took out a pen and a notebook from his pocket and sketched some entertaining scheme. He would show one, and the others would immediately follow. Often the evening continued in the hall, where under the screaming record, shouting the singer, the guys furiously discussed the details of the drawing. And the girls, later brides and wives, with an understanding look at their cavaliers, sighed and went to the kitchen and continued their hen party there. For Thomas and his friends, work was the meaning of life, a hobby, a mission. Helen got used to this character of her husband, especially since this work brought excellent material results. The young engineers had time to work and have fun. Helen did not feel neglected by her husband's attention. On the contrary, when the guests left, the young couple threw themselves into each other's arms as if they had just met after a long separation. Thomas, are you really happy with me? Naively asked Helen, who could not be fed with anything but a verbal declaration of love. Don't you know? Thomas teased her, who, of course, did not believe the cunning wife, who pretended to be a girl and flapped her eyelashes. Oh, the husband is here, marveled Helen in the evening. And I did not look at the time, and dinner is not yet. Well, nothing. Now we'll think of something. The husband rubbed his palms and started cooking. Helen did her best to pretend that she was ready to help him, but most of the time she ended up sitting across from him and began to act out a funny scene in the store or at the bus stop. Thomas laughed, and meanwhile from under his hands came out another miracle of culinary art. Everyone knows that men are the best cooks. Condescension and forgiveness. Now Thomas saw himself from the outside. He forgave his wife not only cute flaws, over time he learned to condescend to her small, if not to say petty concerns about the cozy nest. "Helen, don't you care what I sleep on, what I eat on, and what I cover myself with?" He was puzzled when his wife dragged him to the store for new bedding. "Yes, of course not." Again, Helen's eyes widened in horror. "Let it be beautiful, Thomas. We've got money, so why not buy nice things?" The hostess, who could hardly cook and had no intention of learning, knew what glasses were needed, for what drinks, how to arrange the forks in the order of serving. What dishes, what order? Thomas marveled. "What are you talking about, wife?" He didn't care much about such trifles, although after work he wanted to eat sometimes terribly. The cookery shop on the first floor of their house was a great help. And then the trouble happened. Thomas knew right away that Helen couldn't take it. Yes, she showed miracles of heroism, recognized, worried, searched for doctors, but Thomas knew everything. Helen wasn't his. It was the elusive movement of her lips, the glance cast at him, the tone she used to speak to him. Not a single person would have suspected Helen of a change in her attitude toward her husband. On the contrary, everyone around admired his wife. His attending doctor used to say, "Well, your wife would bring a dead man back to his feet. I envy you." Thomas, who by Helen's breathing could judge her mood, closed himself up too. Suddenly, the warm ray that connected the couple and made his wife his own and the only one. The husband felt in an instant that Helen had already cut him out of her life, and so it turned out. With the move home from the hospital, Thomas became convinced that he had been right. Apparently, it is true that when a sick person is not under a lot of care, he tries to get back on his feet on his own. At home, Helen relaxed, no longer preoccupied with her husband's health. She no longer believed that he could be helped. She tried to use all the resources of free medicine. While her husband was in the hospital, nannies helped him, washed him, served him, moved him on a gurney, rolled him to the right building for examination. Helen only organized and managed the process, and the rest of the deadlines set by the doctors were in an indefinite distance. Maybe later? These words of doctors were supposed to inspire faith in the future, but in fact served only as a consolation to the patient and his relatives. To take him out for paid procedures, to take him somewhere in a wheelchair? No. Helen's not ready for that. How can she cope with such a load? And financially, it was not very good. The supplies they did have, thanks to Thomas's occasional foresight, were quickly melting away. Helen's parents had long since retired, and it was impossible to turn to them for help. Some money was raised by the guys at Thomas's office. What next? Thomas realized that something had to be done urgently. He saw the longing in his wife's eyes, watched how she looked in the mirror, and looked at her wrinkles. Once he waited for her to leave for the store, he called a friend. "Hey, Jack, listen, why don't you give me a job? I'll do what I can for now, and then we'll see. You can't just lie there. Your head'll go flat." "Oh, glad to see you, old man. You're just in time. We need some help around here." Maybe they don't need any help, Thomas reasoned, but if one of his friends approached him, would he refuse? They would decide how to pay him, but he couldn't do without work. There is already on the table is not particularly substantial food lately. When he was engrossed in his work, he immediately forgot about his health problems. Even a couple of times he involuntarily wanted to get up and walk, but immediately remembered his immobility and got angry at the whole world. But unlike Helen, he couldn't show it to anyone. Helen was pitied by everyone. how she takes care of a sick husband, puts her life on the altar of his health. Helen supported this legend in every possible way, giving in and discussing with them diagnoses and treatments. In short, the entire recovery of her spouse, a loyal and strong fighting friend of Thomas. She was able to present herself in such a way that she did not whine, did not complain. However, everyone understood Helen as a heroine and sympathy is absolutely necessary for her. She needed a vacation. Is that conceivable? A young beauty, and she sits alone all day. The mother of one of Helen's friends lamented, "No sleep, no rest, poor girl." It is necessary to rest, my dear. For some reason, no one considered Thomas a society, an invalid, what to talk to him about. And anyway, how to live with only one person for months without going out into the world. Helen, they were beckoning her to visit, inviting her to dinner parties as well. She observed decorum, arriving late and leaving early to court her husband. At one of these evenings she was seated with a tall, gray-eyed, handsome man who kindly courted her, poured wine. He did not dare to ask her to dance, but when he noticed that she was going to leave the society, he asked her to dance. "Would you allow me to escort you?" "Well, if you want, for God's sake," agreed Helen, evaluating, looking at his suit, obviously tailored to order. Broad shoulders. Handing the cape to the closet, the man introduced himself. "I'm Matthew." It was awkward. The table was so noisy. "I have a little business in." He named a town not far away. "I'm here a lot on business with friends. My name is Helen." The girl held out her hand and looked Matthew straight in the eye. I know quite a lot about you," Matthew said, bringing Helen's hand to his lips, and remembering all these events, the man sighed and turned from side to side. The morning is wiser in the evening. He finally decided and allowed himself to remember today. A park, flower beds with flowers, and on a bench under an acacia tree, sitting a beautiful girl. "Susan," Thomas said and smiled. The next day, Susan arrived at exactly 6:00 in the evening. How she managed to get home from work so quickly and to go to the store and cook delicious cutlets at home, Thomas could not understand. Apparently, she was fast and skillful. Having filled the bathtub, without a word, Thomas rolled the chair to her. "Don't argue, please. I helped you yesterday, too. You didn't even wash your feet after the walk, for sure. No excuses today." Susan's stern voice sounded more to herself than to Thomas. It was true, they hadn't had time to do that yesterday, and both of them were embarrassed. So today, the girl had to act like freaking Bach from the cartoon. She helped Thomas to undress down to his underwear and get into the bathtub. Thomas, strangely enough, wasn't too shy. What could he do if he was in such trouble? He would have helped his friend just as much. Susan rubbed his back, her trembling hands occasionally touching the smooth skin, checked again that everything was all right, and walked away hiding an embarrassed look. While Thomas washed, she boiled potatoes, mashed them with butter, milk, and garlic cloves, according to her grandmother's recipe. When the steamed and satisfied Thomas was put in the stroller and brought to the kitchen, everything on the table was sparkling. "Am I in heaven?" Thomas exclaimed and began to eat with pleasure. The evening had brought them closer together. Susan lightly ran her hand over Thomas' head as she said goodbye. "Well, see you tomorrow." He caught her hand, shook it, and said, "Susan, you are certainly a bright hope. You know that, don't you?" "What would I do without you?" 2 weeks passed like a day. Susan realized that in 2 days Helen would be back, and then that would be it. When she arrived at Thomas's house in the evening and opened the door, she was pleasantly surprised. The man was cooking something in the kitchen, and the smell was amazing. Susan entered the kitchen with a smile, looked surprised at the table set, wine, handles. Here, decided to say goodbye. "Wow," said the touched Susan quietly. "Let's have dinner. You must try my baked chicken." They both tried to put everything they were thinking about aside and just enjoyed the evening. Thomas was telling some funny stories and Susan was laughing. At one point she saw Thomas freeze and look at her. Both of them fell silent. That long look revealed to each everything the other was thinking. Susan was looking at him and Thomas was looking at her. "Susan, don't look at me like that. You're tearing my heart out. We just can't have anything because I'm an invalid. I would never put that kind of burden on you. You're not a burden." Susan quietly knelt down beside him and kissed him. In the morning, Susan woke up to someone looking at her, opened her eyes and smiled. Thomas. He buried his face in her hair. "Jesus, Susan, what are you doing to me?" They made breakfast together, and then Thomas walked her to the door. "Susan, leave the keys." The girl nodded, put the keys on the nightstand, and said goodbye. "Thomas, I just want you to know. I've loved you always. I love you now." He covered his ears with his hands. "Don't say anything else. I realized a lot last night. Susan, I'm an invalid. We're not going to change anything. Understand, sooner or later, it will be the same as with Helen. You'll get tired and I won't survive it." "Thomas, no. You're wrong. You're wrong, that's all. When you love someone, you can't get tired of them. I don't want you to live with an invalid. I want you to be fine." "Thomas." He closed the door. Susan stood for a minute and rushed down the stairs, and Helen was going to enjoy the magnificent beaches of Thailand for the next 2 weeks. The clearest water, the almost deserted beach, the magnificent views. They were lucky enough to be in a place that had yet to be developed by tourists. It was great. No men with drunken shouting, no fat women with powerful torsos coming out of their swimsuits, and no one drags food in plastic bags and sacks from the table to their room. Everyone eats right here in the hotel restaurant. Is it any wonder? Such beautiful nothing to do. How long had she dreamed of it? And how long had it taken her to get to this point? But that wasn't even the point. And the sea and the beaches and the delicious food were only so good because Helen was here with her friend Matthew. "Matthew, isn't it great?" For the 100th time she asked Matthew, stroking his powerful arms stretched out on the sand. He lazily lifted himself up, hugged Helen, and hummed contentedly, "I feel good with you everywhere, my bunny," and reached for her neck with his lips, despite the fact that it was terribly hot, and any touch on another's heated body was close to death by number. Helen would laughingly move away, Matthew would pretend to reach for her even more, and this game would keep them occupied for quite some time. Then they'd run for a swim, and when the sun was already high, they'd go to the hotel. "What are we going to do today?" Helen asked a riddle and answered it herself. "We are going to lie down like seals and watch some stupid movie under the air conditioner." For some reason on vacation, it's always the stupid movies you want to watch. Matthew laughed. For Helen, vacation was a stretch, of course, but she didn't realize it. It seemed to her that until now she had been in a terrible captivity, for a long time the slave of some villain who had subjugated her to his cruel will. She had told Matthew so of her existence before their acquaintance. And then, at last, my knight on a white horse appeared and broke the fetters by which I was bound. Such pathos and childish thoughts flashed somewhere in the back of her mind, again bringing the girl back to the distant times of childhood and early romantic youth. "Well, yes, my car is exactly white in color. picked up her chattering lover. What to do? I like light colors. You know, white is the embodiment of purity and freshness. It's a combination of all the colors of the spectrum. Showing her knowledge of physics, Helen continued, I studied once, so I still have at least such scattered information in my head. Oh, you're so smart. Matthew threw himself at her, and the movie was completely forgotten. The young people enjoyed each other, and they did not get bored with this activity neither day nor night. Tired from such a stormy vacation, they fell asleep. Then Helen, who had come to her senses, pushed Matthew out of bed. Matthew, get up quickly. We're going to be late for dinner. Their young bodies demanded support and food to restore their strength, and the lovers rushed downstairs to the restaurant, barely having time to put themselves in some sort of order. However, mores in the hotel were the most free, and it was not customary among rich people to pay attention to who was dressed how. So it was all the same. Even in a loincloth, you could have dinner. A week later, there was a lot more people on the beach. Oh my God, Matthew. Our piece is over. Helen stretched her lips unhappily. Moreover, the female children's voices made it clear that they were from about the same place Helen and Matthew had come from. Oh, come on, Matthew said indifferently. Don't you have enough room? Isn't it cramped? Let them rest. We're not the only ones. He should have listened to Helen's words. He would have done even better if he had taken a closer look at the newly arrived compatriots, but the proverb says that if you knew where to fall, you would have made a bed. Nothing foreshadowed trouble on that usual sunny day vacationers. Having risen early, they tried to have time to sunbathe and swim in the sea. Then swimming was possible only in the pool. The sun was too hot. Helen and Matthew had time to ride a bike and go to a remote area where there was a special temple. Tired from the trip, they slept in the room for a while and in anticipation of dinner, went down to the restaurant. They had their favorite seat and a view from the large window of the sea with their backs to the door. Taking their usual seat, the couple waited for the waiter to bring their order. One of the best evenings of the lovers' lives was passing serenely. Matthew was about to start his coffee when suddenly someone clapped him on the shoulder. Irritation appeared on the man's face instantly, and he turned around to face the impolite passerby. But he had to hold back the scream that was about to burst from his lips. Standing beside him was his business partner, Parker, and this man in the business world occupied a position quite high behind Matthew himself. Charles? Matthew opened his arms cordially. What brings you here? The birthday of the heart, as they say. Hello, Matthew. Charles' voice was rough, as a master of life should be. Is this where you've been hiding from us? I'm calling him. I'm going to offer him a deal, and he's hiding here with his beauty. This is, as I understand, your Melissa, isn't it? And he reached out to Helen with a smile, preparing to shake her hand. Helen. Matthew spoke quickly, and Helen held out her hand to Charles, putting the sweetest smile on her face. I thought you told me you were married to Melissa, didn't you? And you joked that Melissa was the only one who could save me. Charles was surprised and didn't say anything. So what's the deal, Charles? Taking him under his elbow, Matthew tried to steer the conversation away from him. But the moment was lost, and the place for a business conversation looked completely inappropriate. The men stood in the aisle, obstructing the movement of waiters in white uniform tunics, in full view of the entire room. Helen stood completely dumbfounded. The men, of course, could neither move away nor sit down at the table until the situation was clarified, and she decided to be the first to clarify it. Quickly crashing between the interlocutors, she addressed Charles first. Did you say married to Melissa? Her eyes bore into the man's. He was confused. Well, yes, at Christmas. Didn't everyone say hello at the banquet? Turning sharply to Matthew, Helen almost knocked his head on his chin. Are you married? Matthew remained stupidly silent. Charles, too, moved slightly aside in confusion, not knowing how to get out of the unpleasant situation, while Helen's shrieking could be heard throughout the restaurant. You tricked me. You said you were going to go to the mountains at Christmas, and you were organizing a wedding at the same time. Shut up, quiet. But menacingly Matthew told her, with anger looking into her blue eyes. There are people here. The girl was out of breath. Oh, there are people here, she shouted hysterically, and I'm not a human being. You're a scoundrel. You're a cheat. She slapped the man on the cheek. The restaurant patrons watched them in amazement. Matthew grabbed Helen by the arms and tried to stop her, but she stubbornly pulled out of his arms, trying to scratch his face, pull out his hair, or injure him in any way. A matron in a black tuxedo was already approaching them, summoned by a waiter. Matthew let go of Helen, turned abruptly, and left without paying for dinner. Helen was led out under the arms from behind her and taken to an office where they gave her water and tried to calm her down. Madam, the matron said to her politely, I sympathize with your troubles, but your companion has not paid for the dinner, and this is too much money for us to let you go without payment. Would you be so kind as to make a settlement? He bowed respectfully to Helen. Fortunately, she still had enough money on her card to pay the restaurant bill, and she managed to avoid an embarrassing eviction from the hotel and a scandal. When she finally returned to her room, she saw that Matthew's things were gone, and the corridor clerk informed her that the gentleman in the room had left the hotel with his luggage. It turned out that Matthew had gone home to his family that evening. Helen, who had spent all her savings on her card at the restaurant, was still lucky that the hotel room had been paid for in advance when Matthew had booked it, and the return ticket in electronic form was already in her phone. Helen was both anguished and excited at the same time to be able to go home. But stronger than all the mixed feelings, rage and hatred for her lover raged in her. After thinking for a while, she decided to live out the paid term in the hotel. She did not want to change her ticket without knowing the language, but more than this difficulty, she was frightened by the thought that the exchange would require additional expenses. There was only a little money left, she pondered. The breakfasts at the hotel were paid for. She could use her pennies to buy the cheapest food during the day. How much did she really need? Eat better in the morning, go to breakfast later. There's no way she'll be traveling to resorts and beaches anytime soon. At least she could have some fun at the expense of that asshole Matthew. Helen didn't care about the moral side of her affair. The scandal at the restaurant didn't stop her from enjoying a full breakfast alone either. Men, regulars of the restaurant, could not but remember the bright lady who slapped her companion in public, and there were no men willing to approach Helen. And what kind of acquaintance is there in the morning, whether sober or hungover? Of course, all this did not add to Helen's mood. She spent the rest of the time alone, driving away from herself the thoughts of returning home soon. But subconsciously she tuned herself to her old life to meet her husband. She hadn't called him once while she'd been with Matthew, and now calls had become an expense. Nothing. The young woman consoled herself. Thomas hadn't gone anywhere. He hadn't started walking without me. I'll live peacefully and quietly, and I don't care about people like Matthew, the bastard. And the indignation, so diligently suppressed by her, flared up again inside. The image of the lover she now hated came back to her in a completely different form. She remembered his manner of deafening laughter, his grimaces when he tried to be nice to her. Greedy bastard. Helen sputtered to herself. could not take a 5-star hotel, then I could at least to the end of the human rest. Of course, after a couple of days, the anger dulled in Helen, lying under an umbrella on the beach, already lazily, only by inertia, went over in her head the options for revenge against the traitor Matthew. Why is he a traitor? Helen could not explain, as she saw the situation only from her side. When her stay at the hotel had ended, she had thoughtlessly packed her suitcases, which now had to be carried by herself. She didn't want to pay anyone, for fear of unforeseen expenses. Automatically packing, she indifferently looked around the room, the bed on which she had spent the first week so happily and the last few days so longingly. She had relaxed a little on the plane. The journey was already tiring, and coupled with the sad thoughts had upset Helen. She arrived home with no mood. She left her suitcases in the hallway and went into the kitchen, where Thomas was sitting at the table, singing tea and cake. Did the pie look homemade? The girl noted with a keen eye as she walked, and Thomas said, "Hello, hello." Thomas replied, looking intently at his wife, "How was your vacation?" "Fine." Faintly, Helen answered, not paying attention to her husband's tone. Having washed her hands, she was going to have tea too. She liked home-cooked food much better than restaurant meals, and airplane lunches were terrible. She couldn't lie. It's tasteless, like chewing on paper or rags. At home, at first glance, everything was fine. Looking around the kitchen, Helen noticed everything. A sparkling clean gas stove, obviously recently washed curtains on the window, a small bunch of flowers blazing on the windowsill. No sign of dirty dishes or cooking. Thomas left almost everything in order after cooking too, but now there was a woman's hand in everything. Helen was already sure that Susan would not let her down, a proven person. "You don't look like you're back from vacation. Why are you in no mood?" Thomas asked again. Helen was silent, cutting off a large piece of potato and meat pie. Without looking at her husband, she poured herself some tea from the heated kettle and sat down across from him. "Oh yes, I forgot to ask, how was Matthew?" "Didn't disappoint." Helen hesitated, bringing a piece of cake to her mouth, but then grinned, not wanting to show her confusion. Had Susan snitched? What a fool, in love with you like a cat, even that you are. Helen nodded at the stroller. Doesn't stop her. "Don't you dare talk about her like that." Thomas was angry. Helen squinted her beautiful blue eyes. "Honey, did you two have an affair while I was away?" "Why? A knave fool and an invalid. What's not a couple?" At her own words, Helen laughed, forgetting the cake and tea. So funny, she thought, was the picture before her eyes. Susan looking at her husband and Thomas, pathetic in his wheelchair. What a bunch of weirdos, finding each other too. Thomas gritted his teeth. "Well, that's that, my dear. You can pack your things and go away. I knew about your affair a long time ago, and Susan had nothing to do with it. You've lost your conscience. In front of me, you've made dates and made love to your Matthew. I was hoping that at least you'd be sensible enough to come to your senses. To be so mean and come home without a shred of conscience? Are you sick, Thomas, or did you hit your head? Do you really think Susan's gonna take care of you now? Nobody wants you. You realize what you are, don't you? You're an invalid, a freak, an unfit freak. Do you even realize that?" Helen, heated by her husband's words, didn't remember that she had an unfinished piece of pie in her hand and crumbs stuck in the corners of her lips. With a wave of her hands, she knocked over the hot tea and shrieked, shaking off her dress. Further insults came as if from the horn of plenty. Thomas did not tolerate it and shouted, "Get ready." Helen grabbed the phone. "Hello, Susan. Don't you have anyone else to talk to? What are you doing with the inferior?" "I'm laughing my ass off right now. A handicapped man has found a mistress. Now you listen to me. I'm not going anywhere. Don't even try." "What? You're going to move out of your grandmother's house and into an apartment? Don't dream of it." Throwing the phone away, she turned to Thomas with flared nostrils. "Don't even think about living in this apartment." She turned to Thomas. "In fact, I'll sue you for maintenance. You're obliged to maintain me." Thomas, as if seeing his wife for the first time, she looked like a witch from a horror movie, beautiful and scary at the same time. Blue flames blazed in her eyes. Her scarlet lips changed their shape, from a sinister smile to a contemptuous curve. Her hair spilled over her shoulders, and the woman was evil incarnate. Thomas even laughed. "How'd that make you feel? You even looked prettier when you started calling me names." "Calm down. Forget about your dreams. I'm disabled, and I got my apartment from my parents. So, Helen, you're gonna have to go to Matthew." The mention of her sneaky lover threw Helen off balance. She ripped her coat off the rack in a frenzy and ran out the door, cursing Thomas, Susan, and everything in the world. Susan hung up the phone and cried. Helen had just climbed, in big muddy boots, into her soul, and in 2 minutes had trampled everything possible there, professionally trampled. God, why is everything so complicated? Why does she, Susan, get everything through the cracks, and not just straight and simple like the others? But if you think about it, Helen's right. Susan, her friend, just took advantage of Helen's absence. She's a regular bitch. And once again, Susan's days became gray and dull. Again, there was no reason to be happy, healed like before, only it was even harder. Now she didn't know how the man she loved smelled, what strong hands he had, how he knew how to lift her spirits and calm her down. It was all the more difficult to realize that now she would never be able to forget Thomas, and at the same time she would never be together with him. She would try to avoid even a chance meeting with him, but she had lost her friend too, and forever too. Susan got up in the morning, habitually drank her coffee with a sandwich, habitually went to work, talked, did everything that was supposed to be done there, even conscientiously and honestly. She could even smile. Outwardly, it was the same Susan. Only when she got home in the evening, she remembered those 15 days she had spent with Thomas. And no matter how hard she tried to push the memories away, she couldn't. As soon as the cheerful orange toenails came her way, she thought, "Is my bookcase still on his window?" She also smiled sadly. Thrown away long ago, of course. After all, it had been half a month since Helen had arrived. Walking into the pastry shop, I involuntarily searched with my eyes for a beautiful cake. I wish I could buy one so that I could have tea with Thomas in the evening. I shook my head and scolded myself. How could anyone go so crazy? How could you let yourself do such a thing? To develop in a couple of weeks an enduring habit toward the man, a habit of measuring everything in the world against Thomas's existence as if he belonged to her. No, it would drive her crazy. Something had to be done. Meanwhile, time passed, changing the pictures outside the window. The greenery on the trees was darker, the leaves had lost their freshness, and in some places they were tanning brown or even yellowing at the edges. The grass on the lawns also wilted a little. Only the sturdy marigolds, absolutely as before, shone bright orange like little suns, bringing joy to the sad landscape. Several months passed. Helen had not called once during that time, and Susan, of course, had not called either. Calling Thomas was out of the question. Susan felt guilty, and now a new feeling was slowly taking hold. She regretted what had happened, but not that she had betrayed her friend. No, she deeply regretted that she had not been able to convince Thomas that he was worthy of love and happiness. She should have gone back and rushed after him and told him he was no invalid. Doesn't she care if he's in a wheelchair or driving an expensive car? After all, he's still him. A priceless man with all his talents and inherent in him alone, marvelous eyes and noble heart. There was no telling how much longer this state of hers would last, hope mixed with the determination growing inside. It was becoming more her own, considered, fictionalized to her with each passing day. It became so much easier to live when Susan realized it seemed herself. She was now calm and confident. Even her gait changed in Susan, becoming more confident. Her back straightened, the girl seemed taller and slimmer. That evening she came home from work earlier than usual. She didn't want to go anywhere. Susan aspired for some reason to her cozy house, to the familiar comfort of wooden walls, where warmth and music always reigned. First of all, having turned on the melodies of the past years, she washed her hands and went to the kitchen to prepare a simple dinner. "What's up?" she asked from the refrigerator. "What are you guarding here?" The refrigerator was silent. Susan took out defrosted meat and potatoes and stood at the stove with a knife in her hand. "Who am I cooking all this for?" she said bitterly, forgetting how she had just been walking briskly down the street, convincing herself that life in mid-September was wonderful. How quickly do girls who live alone in a small old house change their moods? Her musings were interrupted by a knock on the door. Susan stood up. It must be one of the neighbors, for salt or matches. The houses in the private sector were densely packed, and everyone knew each other. And since it was a short walk to the store, they often went to each other's houses for small things. As a matter of course, they took for granted small requests to neighbors and mutual favors and services. Susan walked quietly, but had time to wonder as she walked. The door was normally open, and they came in easily, without ringing or knocking. She opened the door and almost fell in. On the porch was Thomas. He had a huge bouquet of flowers in his lap. And yes, they were fragrant, fire-burning marigolds, Susan's ubiquitous and adored small flowers. Coals burning, even releasing already in the semi-darkness. Several months passed. Helen had not called once during that time, and Susan, of course, had not called either. Calling Thomas was out of the question. Susan felt guilty, and now a new feeling was slowly taking hold. She regretted what had happened, but not that she had betrayed her friend. No, she deeply regretted that she had not been able to convince Thomas that he was worthy of love and happiness. She should have gone back and rushed after him and told him he was no invalid. Doesn't she care if he's in a wheelchair or driving an expensive car? After all, he's still him. A priceless man with all his talents and inherent in him alone, marvelous eyes and noble heart. There was no telling how much longer this state of hers would last, hope mixed with the determination growing inside. It was becoming more her own, considered, fictionalized to her with each passing day. It became so much easier to live when Susan realized it seemed herself. She was now calm and confident. Even her gait changed in Susan, becoming more confident. Her back straightened. The girl seemed taller and slimmer. That evening she came home from work earlier than usual. She didn't want to go anywhere. Susan aspired for some reason to her cozy house, to the familiar comfort of wooden walls, where warmth and music always reigned. First of all, having turned on the melodies of the past years, she washed her hands and went to the kitchen to prepare a simple dinner. "What's up?" she asked from the refrigerator. "What are you guarding here?" The refrigerator was silent. Susan took out defrosted meat and potatoes and stood at the stove with a knife in her hand. "Who am I cooking all this for?" she said bitterly, forgetting how she had just been walking briskly down the street, convincing herself that life in mid-September was wonderful. How quickly do girls who live alone in a small old house change their moods? Her musings were interrupted by a knock on the door. Susan stood up. It must be one of the neighbors, for salt or matches. The houses in the private sector were densely packed and everyone knew each other, and since it was a short walk to the store, they often went to each other's houses for small things. As a matter of course, they took for granted small requests to neighbors and mutual favors and services. Susan walked quietly, but had time to wonder as she walked. The door was normally open and they came in easily, without ringing or knocking. She opened the door and almost fell in. On the porch was Thomas. He had a huge bouquet of flowers in his lap. And yes, they were fragrant, fire-burning marigolds, Susan's ubiquitous and adored small flowers. Coals burning, even releasing already in the semi-darkness. Susan awed and pressed her hands to her cheeks. "Susan, in short, I can't be without you." If the prospect of being the wife of an invalid doesn't frighten you, Jesus, Thomas, what are you talking about? What kind of invalid are you? Susan deftly rolled Thomas' wheelchair across the threshold and stepped forward to open the door. Thomas rolled smoothly inside, stopping in the kitchen. He smiled and rubbed his hands together. "It seems there's no need for man hands around here. What good timing, if you only knew." Susan whispered, lowering herself into the chair next to Thomas and reaching for him. However, the endless hugs and kisses did not prevent the lovers from preparing a delicious dinner. After all, Thomas had become almost a pro at cooking, practicing in the kitchen almost from the beginning of his stroller life. They talked loudly across the hallways of the room, heard no response, talked again, and it didn't matter what about. Susan, eyes shining, was running back and forth through the house because she had decided to set dinner in the hall. She pulled out the festive tablecloth, rattled the cups from her grandmother's set, ran to the kitchen to wash the flutes. Then she laughed for a long time without saying why. After she laughed, she confessed to Thomas, "I don't have any wine to pour into the glasses. The store's closed. What's the trouble?" Thomas reassured her, "We'll pour tea in them." After confessing their love to each other 100 times, the young people finally sat down at the table. They clinked the tea poured into crystal flutes, and Thomas coughed, playing the old Toastmaster. Let us drink this divine nectar to the fact that the walls of this splendid house will never hear the crying or see the tears of its beautiful mistress. Susan, looking confusedly into Thomas's eyes, interrupted him at the last words. "A beautiful toast. Thank you, Thomas. But you know, I suggest we drink to something else. I have a surprise for you, so let's drink to it." She held out a leaf across the table to Thomas. The man took it carefully in both hands and scrutinized it carefully. It was not a clear picture from the ultrasound machine, but a photograph of a new life being born.